A 20-year-old woman stepped off a train into a frozen Wyoming night with nothing but two battered cases and a teaching contract she wasn't sure anyone would honor. No lamp burned at the station, no wagon waited. The darkness stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the distant howl of coyotes closing in. Eleanor Whitmore had gambled everything on escape, and now she was utterly, terrifyingly alone, until a rancher's weathered hands lifted her from the dirt road where exhaustion had finally claimed her. That moment would change two lives forever. If you want to see how a desperate flight from shame became the most unlikely love story the frontier had ever witnessed, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The train lurched to a stop with a metallic shriek that sent Eleanor's stomach into her throat. She pressed her gloved hand against the cold window, peering through the October darkness at what was supposed to be Red Hollow, Wyoming territory. There was no platform, no building, just a stretch of frozen dirt beside the tracks and a wooden post driven into the ground with Red Hollow, painted in letters so faded they were barely legible. The conductor appeared in the aisle, his expression somewhere between bored and sympathetic. "This is your stop, miss." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the handle of her worn leather case. "Are you certain? There's nothing here." "Red Hollow's about 3 miles north. Town don't maintain a proper station. You got someone meeting you?" She swallowed hard. The letter from the Red Hollow School Committee had mentioned arrangements, but it had been vague. "I was told transportation would be provided." The conductor glanced out the window at the empty darkness. "Well, they ain't here now. We can't wait. Schedule's already behind." Panic fluttered in Eleanor's chest, but she forced it down with the iron discipline her mother had drilled into her before the fever took her. Whitmore women did not make scenes. They adapted. They endured. "Of course." She stood, smoothing her traveling dress with hands that only trembled slightly. "Thank you for your assistance." The conductor helped her down with her 2 cases, then climbed back aboard without another word. The train pulled away with a blast of steam and a grinding of wheels, and then Eleanor was alone in a silence so complete it felt like drowning. The wind cut through her wool coat like it was made of paper. She'd left Philadelphia in early autumn warmth. Nobody had warned her that October in Wyoming meant winter. Her breath came out in white clouds. Above her, stars blazed in a sky so vast and dark it made her feel impossibly small. She picked up her cases and started walking north, following the rutted road that paralleled the tracks. 3 miles. She could manage 3 miles. After 20 minutes, her arms ached. After 40, her fingers had gone numb despite her gloves. The cases kept banging against her legs, and her fashionable button boots, perfectly adequate for Philadelphia sidewalks, were not made for frozen dirt roads filled with rocks and ruts. She stumbled twice, catching herself before she fell, but barely. Something howled in the darkness. Not a dog. Closer. Then another howl answered from a different direction. Coyotes. Eleanor's heart hammered. She'd read about coyotes in her research before accepting the position. They rarely attacked humans. Rarely. She kept walking, trying to ignore the way the howls seemed to be circling closer. Her right boot caught on a rock, and this time she couldn't catch herself. She went down hard on her knees, pain shooting up her legs. One of her cases popped open, spilling clothes onto the frozen ground. A cream-colored blouse her mother had embroidered fluttered away in the wind before Eleanor could grab it. She knelt there in this dirt, breathing hard, fighting the urge to cry. This was a mistake. All of it. Running from Philadelphia, from her father's debts, from the marriage arrangement that would have saved the family but destroyed her. It had been the act of a coward, not the brave new start she'd tried to convince herself it was. Another howl, so close she could hear the animal's breath between the notes. Eleanor forced herself to stand. She gathered what she could salvage from the spilled case, cramming it back inside with shaking hands. She didn't bother latching it properly. She just picked up both cases and kept walking, even though every step sent pain through her bruised knees. The road stretched endlessly ahead. No lights, no town, just darkness and cold and the sound of coyotes drawing closer. After another mile, or maybe it was only 100 yards, she'd lost all sense of distance. Eleanor's arms finally gave out. The cases dropped from her numb fingers. She sank down beside them, too exhausted to go another step. The wind howled. Or maybe that was more coyotes. She couldn't tell anymore. She'd left Philadelphia 12 days ago with a second-class ticket, $17 she'd saved in secret over 3 years, and a teaching contract from a school committee desperate enough to hire an unmarried woman sight unseen. The letter had promised housing, a salary of $40 per month, and a fresh start in a territory where nobody knew about her father's gambling debts or the scandal that had destroyed her engagement to Thomas Whitfield before the wedding invitations were even printed. What it hadn't promised was dying alone on a frozen road in Wyoming. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter and closed her eyes. Just for a moment. She was so tired. She didn't mean to fall asleep, but exhaustion dragged her under like a weight tied to her ankles. Coaxed. The rattle of wagon wheels and the clop of horse hooves pulled her back to consciousness. Eleanor's eyes flew open. Darkness still pressed in from all sides, but now there was a lantern swinging from a wagon that had stopped a few feet from where she lay crumpled beside her cases. A man's voice, rough with surprise. Christ almighty! Heavy footsteps crunched on the frozen ground. Then a figure knelt beside her, and Eleanor found herself staring up at a face that belonged to the frontier the way her embroidered blouses belonged to Philadelphia drawing rooms. Hard jaw shadowed with stubble. Lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind. Dark hair that needed cutting. He was maybe 30, maybe older. The kind of weathering that came from years outdoors made age difficult to guess. His eyes were brown, and they were currently fixed on her with an expression somewhere between concern and disbelief. "You alive?" he asked. Eleanor managed a nod. Her voice came out as a croak. "I believe so." "What the hell are you doing out here?" "Traveling to Red Hollow." She tried to sit up, and the world spun. The man caught her shoulder with one large, work-roughened hand. "Easy. You're half frozen." He glanced at her cases. "You the new schoolteacher?" "Yes." Eleanor Whitmore. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "They said they'd hired someone from back east. Didn't mention they'd left her to freeze to death." "The train arrived early. Perhaps my transportation was delayed." "Your transportation was scheduled for tomorrow morning." He stood, then bent and picked her up as if she weighed nothing, which was humiliating and also the only thing keeping her from collapsing back into the dirt. "Ben Hartley was supposed to meet you with his wagon. Nobody told him the train was coming in tonight." Eleanor wanted to protest being carried like a child, but her legs had stopped working properly, and the man's coat smelled like wood smoke and leather, and something she couldn't name, but that made her feel oddly safe. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." "Don't apologize for almost dying. Makes people uncomfortable." He deposited her on the wagon bench with surprising gentleness, then went back for her cases. He tossed them in the back without ceremony, climbed up beside her, and took the reins. "Riker Boone, I've got a ranch north of town." "Thank you, Mr. Boone. I'm very grateful." "Don't thank me yet. You might still lose some toes to frostbite." He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched into motion. "What possessed you to walk 3 miles in the dark?" "I was told the town was close." 3 miles is close out here." Eleanor had no response to that. In Philadelphia, 3 miles meant hiring a carriage or taking a streetcar. Here, apparently it meant risking your life on a frozen road surrounded by coyotes. They rode in silence for a while. The wagon lantern swung with the movement, casting wild shadows across the landscape. Now that she wasn't alone and dying, Eleanor could actually see the country around her. Rolling hills stretched away on both sides of the road, covered in low scrub and occasional stands of pine. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks white with early snow. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. "First time west?" Riker asked. "Yes." "Running from something or running towards something?" The question was too perceptive. Eleanor kept her eyes on the darkness ahead. "I'm here to teach school, Mr. Boone. That's all." "Most people who come out here alone are running from something." He said it matter-of-factly, without judgment. "Doesn't make them cowards. Sometimes running is the smartest thing you can do." Eleanor glanced at him, but his face was unreadable in the lantern light. "And what are you running from?" "Who says I'm running?" "You're out here alone at night." The corner of his mouth twitched. Might have been a smile. "Touché, Miss Whitmore." They rounded a bend, and suddenly there were lights ahead. Not many, maybe 24 buildings scattered along both sides of the road, but after the endless darkness, it looked like civilization. Red Hollow. The town was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, and rougher. Most of the buildings were wood frame construction, weathered gray by sun and wind. There was a general store with a false front, a saloon with light spilling from its windows, what looked like a livery stable, and a handful of houses set back from the main road. At the far end of town, she could just make out a small church, and beside it, a modest building that had to be the schoolhouse. Riker guided the wagon down the main street, past the saloon where someone was playing a badly out-of-tune piano. A few people glanced out as they passed, curious faces appearing briefly in lit windows before disappearing again. He stopped in front of a two-story house with a painted sign that read, Mrs. Foster's Boarding House. Lamps burned in the downstairs windows. "This is where the school committee arranged lodging for you," Riker said, setting the brake. "Mrs. Foster's decent. Keeps a clean house. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 7, no male visitors past 8 o'clock. He climbed down and came around to help Eleanor. Her legs still felt unsteady, but she managed to stand without embarrassing herself. Riker retrieved her cases from the wagon bed. The front door of the boarding house flew open and a woman appeared, silhouetted against the lamplight. She was somewhere in her 50s, built solid, with iron gray hair pinned in a no-nonsense bun. "Riker Boone, what in the name of... is that the schoolteacher?" "Found her halfway to town," Riker said. "Train came in early." Mrs. Foster's expression shifted to horror. "Sweet mercy! Ben wasn't supposed to fetch her until tomorrow morning." She hurried down the steps. "Come inside, dear. You must be frozen solid. Riker, bring her things." Eleanor found herself ushered into a warm front hall that smelled like bread and wood polish. Mrs. Foster took her coat with practiced efficiency, clucking over the state of Eleanor's dress and the mud on her boots. "We'll get you warmed up and fed," Mrs. Foster said. "I've got a room ready upstairs, small but clean. Riker, set those cases by the stairs." Riker did as he was told, then tipped his hat to Eleanor. "Welcome to Red Hollow, Miss Whitmore. Hope it gets better from here." "Thank you again, Mr. Boone. Truly." He nodded and left, pulling the door shut behind him. Through the window, Eleanor watched him climb back onto the wagon and drive away into the night. "That man's a saint," Mrs. Foster said, steering Eleanor toward the stairs. "Quiet as stone and twice as stubborn, but he's got a good heart. Saved my youngest son from drowning 3 years back. Now come on, let's get you settled." The room upstairs was indeed small, just large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, a small desk, and a trunk for storage. But it was warm and clean, with a patchwork quilt on the bed and curtains at the single window. After sleeping in trains and cheap hotels for nearly 2 weeks, it looked like paradise. Mrs. Foster brought up a basin of hot water, a plate of cold chicken and bread, and a thick flannel nightgown. "You eat and wash up. Tomorrow we'll introduce you properly to the school committee and get you oriented. The schoolhouse is in fair shape, some repairs needed, but nothing too terrible. You'll have about 15 students to start, more once word spreads that school's actually in session." Eleanor managed a few bites of chicken while Mrs. Foster talked, laying out the rhythms of life in Red Hollow. Church on Sundays. Town meetings once a month. The general store kept reasonable prices. Doc Morrison was a drunk but competent when sober. Watch out for Henry Caulfield. He ran the saloon and had wandering hands. When Mrs. Foster finally left, Eleanor stripped off her filthy traveling clothes and washed with the hot water, hissing as feeling returned to her frozen fingers and toes. No frostbite, thank heaven, just bruises and exhaustion. She pulled on the nightgown and crawled under the quilt. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the boarding house settling for the night. Someone coughing. Footsteps overhead. The distant sound of the saloon piano. Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself feel, just for a moment, the enormity of what she'd done. 3,000 miles from everything she'd ever known. Alone. No way back even if she wanted to go. She'd left Philadelphia with her father's furious voice ringing in her ears. "You're ruining this family, you're selfish, you're throwing away your only chance." Maybe he was right. Maybe she was selfish. But she couldn't marry Richard Thornton, no matter how much it would have helped her father's debts. Richard was 43, twice widowed, and when he'd kissed her hand during their engagement, his smile had made her skin crawl. The wedding had been 3 weeks away when she'd found the teaching advertisement in the newspaper and written to Red Hollow on impulse. Their response had come back within 10 days. Hired, $40 a month. Housing provided. Start October 15th. She'd taken $17 from the household money her father gave her for managing the servants, money she'd been carefully skimming and hiding for 3 years, ever since her mother died, and she'd realized that her father's gambling was going to destroy them all. She'd left a note saying only that she was sorry, but she couldn't go through with the marriage. Then she'd walked out with her 2 cases and never looked back. Running, just like Riker Boone had said, but running toward something too. Freedom, independence, a life that was hers, if she survived it. Yimt. Morning came too early. Eleanor woke to pale sunlight streaming through the curtains and the smell of frying bacon drifting up from downstairs. Her entire body ached. Her knees were purple with bruises, but she was alive and warm, which was more than she'd expected last night. She dressed carefully in her best day dress, dark blue wool, practical but respectable, and pinned up her blonde hair in the neat bun she'd been wearing since she was 16. In the small mirror above the washstand, her reflection looked pale and tired, but composed. Whitmore women did not fall apart, even when they probably should. Downstairs, the dining room held 6 other boarders, 4 men who looked like ranch hands, an older couple who ran a freight business, and a young woman about Eleanor's age who introduced herself as Sarah Brennan. "I work at the general store," Sarah said, her smile warm and curious. "Everyone's been talking about the new teacher. We haven't had proper schooling here in almost 2 years since Miss Hargrove left to get married." Breakfast was bacon, eggs, biscuits with gravy, and coffee so strong Eleanor's eyes watered. She ate mechanically while Mrs. Foster explained that Ben Hartley would be by at 9 o'clock to take her to meet the school committee and see the schoolhouse. "Most of the committee are just ranch families who want their children educated," Mrs. Foster said, refilling Eleanor's coffee cup. "Martin Dietrich is the chairman. He runs cattle north of here. His wife Margaret is a force of nature. She'll have opinions about everything, but her heart's in the right place." Ben Hartley turned out to be a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and an apologetic manner. "I'm real sorry about last night, Miss Whitmore. Nobody told me the train was coming in early. If I'd known—" "It's quite all right, Mr. Hartley. No harm done." "Except you nearly froze to death," Sarah put in. She'd offered to accompany them, ostensibly to help, but mostly, Eleanor suspected, out of pure curiosity. "Lucky Riker found you." "Very lucky," Eleanor agreed. They walked down the main street toward the schoolhouse. In daylight, Red Hollow looked even smaller and rougher than it had last night. Most of the buildings needed paint. The street was rutted mud, frozen now, but probably a swamp when it rained. A few people were out, women with shopping baskets, men loading wagons at the general store, and they all stopped to stare at Eleanor as she passed. The schoolhouse was a simple frame building with a small bell tower and 6 windows, 3 on each side. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. Desks were arranged in rows, most of them scarred with initials and ink stains. A blackboard hung on the front wall. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, cold and rusty. Eleanor walked slowly down the center aisle, taking it all in. It was nothing like the private academy where she'd attended school in Philadelphia, with its proper desks and maps and library. But it was hers, her school, her classroom. "It needs work," Ben said apologetically. "We've got funds for books and supplies, and Matthew Cooper's agreed to fix the stove and patch the roof before winter really sets in." "It's perfect," Eleanor said, and meant it. The door opened and the couple entered. Martin and Margaret Dietrich, Eleanor guessed. Martin was tall and raw-boned with a beard going gray. Margaret was shorter, round, and had the air of someone who did not suffer fools. "Miss Whitmore," Margaret said, her voice carrying authority, "we're so pleased you've arrived safely despite the confusion last night. I've heard all about your ordeal. Terrible. Simply terrible." Martin shook Eleanor's hand with a grip that made her wince. "Welcome to Red Hollow. We're grateful to have you. Our children need proper education if they're going to make something of themselves." Over the next hour, 3 more committee members arrived. John Brennan, Sarah's father who ran the general store, Doc Morrison, who reeked of whiskey even at 10 in the morning, and Patricia Wells, a sharp-eyed woman who taught Sunday school and clearly considered herself the moral compass of Red Hollow. They asked Eleanor about her qualifications. She explained that she'd been educated at Mrs. Whitfield's Academy for Young Ladies in Philadelphia, had spent 2 years assisting with her mother's charity school before the fever took her, and was prepared to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, and basic science to students of all ages. Can you keep order? Patricia Wells asked, her tone skeptical. The last teacher couldn't manage the older boys. They ran wild. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. I can keep order, Mrs. Wells. What about curriculum? We want our children learning proper values. I'll teach reading, writing, and arithmetic as the foundation. History and geography to give them understanding of the world. Science to teach them how to think critically. And proper values, Eleanor added, seeing Patricia's expression, are best taught by example. Margaret Dietrich smiled. Well said. They discussed logistics. School would run Monday through Friday, 9 to 3, with a break for lunch. Eleanor would be responsible for preparing lessons, maintaining discipline, and organizing an end-of-year examination. The committee would provide books, slates, chalk, and firewood. Her salary would be paid quarterly. When can you start? Martin asked. Tomorrow, if you'd like. Martin looked surprised, then pleased. Tomorrow it is, then. That afternoon, Eleanor threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse. Sarah helped, and together they swept the floors, washed the windows, and arranged the desks into a more orderly configuration. Ben Hartley brought over a load of firewood and showed Eleanor how to work the temperamental stove. Margaret Dietrich arrived with a stack of primers, McGuffey readers, and a much-used arithmetic text. These are old but serviceable, Margaret said. We'll order more books when the freight wagon comes through next month. By evening, Eleanor's hands were filthy and her back ached, but the schoolhouse looked almost respectable. She stood at the front of the room, imagining it filled with students tomorrow morning, and felt a flutter of nervousness. She'd helped her mother teach charity students in Philadelphia, but this was different. This was her school, her responsibility. Walking back to the boarding house in the twilight, Eleanor passed the ranch road that led north out of town. She paused, remembering Riker Boone's face in the lantern light last night. He'd asked if she was running from something or toward something, and she hadn't answered honestly. Both, she thought. She was running from a life that would have destroyed her, and running toward something she didn't quite understand yet. Freedom? Maybe. Or just the chance to build something that was hers. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and coming snow. Winter was coming, Margaret had warned her. Real winter, not the pale Philadelphia version. Food would be scarce, travel difficult. The town would hunker down and survive until spring. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter and kept walking. She'd survived the first night. She'd survived the school committee. She'd figure out the rest as it came. The first day of school arrived with clear skies and temperatures that made Eleanor's breath frost in the air. She arrived at the schoolhouse an hour early, lit the stove, wrote the day's lessons on the blackboard, and arranged the primers on the front desk. Then she stood at the door and waited. The students arrived in clusters. First came 3 small children, siblings, from the look of them, led by their mother, who promised they were well-behaved and left before Eleanor could respond. Then a group of 5, ranging from about 8 to 12, dropped off by a grizzled ranch hand who tipped his hat and drove away without a word. 2 teenage boys sauntered up the road, late, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. By 9:15, Eleanor had 14 students ranging from 6 years old to roughly 16. They stared at her with varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and open hostility. Eleanor took a breath and stepped to the front of the room. Good morning, my name is Miss Whitmore. This is your school and we're going to learn together. Let's start with introductions. The young ones were easy, eager, shy, sweet. The middle group was louder but manageable. The 2 older boys, however, were a problem. Their names were Tom and Jake, they were brothers, and they spent the entire morning whispering, laughing, and ignoring her instructions. At noon, Eleanor dismissed the class for lunch. Most of the children had brought food from home. She had a sandwich Mrs. Foster had packed. She ate it at her desk while the students scattered outside and tried not to think about the fact that Tom and Jake had spent the last hour making it abundantly clear they didn't respect her authority. The afternoon was worse. During arithmetic, Tom threw a wad of paper at his brother. During geography, Jake made a rude noise every time Eleanor turned to write on the board. The younger children started giggling. Eleanor felt control slipping away like water through her fingers. Finally, she'd had enough. Tom and Jake, please stay after school. The rest of you are dismissed. The other students filed out quickly, sensing trouble. Tom and Jake remained sprawled in their seats, expressions sullen. Eleanor faced them. This is my classroom. You will show respect or you will leave. Or what? Jake said. You gonna make us? I don't need to make you. You can choose to be here and learn, or you can choose to leave and spend your days working cattle. But you won't disrupt my classroom. Tom laughed. Our father pays for this school. You work for us. It was probably true. Eleanor didn't care. Your father pays for his children to receive an education. If you don't want that education, I'm sure he'd be happy to put you to work full-time on his ranch. That struck a nerve. Tom's smirk faltered. You can't. I can, and I will. Tomorrow morning, you'll arrive on time, you'll sit quietly, you'll complete your work, and you'll treat me and your fellow students with respect. Or I'll speak with your father about why his money is being wasted on children who don't want to learn. Your choice. She held their gazes until they looked away. After a long moment, Tom muttered, Fine. Fine what? Fine, Miss Whitmore. Good, you're dismissed. They left, but not before Jake shot her a look that promised this wasn't over. Eleanor sank into her chair, hands shaking. She'd won this round, but barely. If they decided to test her again, and they would, she wasn't sure she could maintain control. The door opened and she looked up, expecting one of the boys returning to make more trouble. Instead, it was Riker Boone. He leaned against the doorframe, hat in his hands. Heard you had a rough first day. News travels quickly. Small town. He stepped inside, glancing around the schoolhouse. Tom and Jake Brennan are Sarah's cousins. Their father spoils them. They've run off 2 teachers already. They won't run me off. Riker studied her for a moment. No, I don't think they will. Was there something you needed, Mr. Boone? Just checking on you, making sure you survived. He paused. And to tell you that if those boys give you real trouble, their father owes me a favor. I can have a word. Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt. I appreciate the offer, but I need to handle this myself. If I can't keep order in my own classroom, I don't deserve to be here. Riker nodded slowly. Fair enough, but the offer stands. He put his hat back on. Welcome to Red Hollow, Miss Whitmore. For real this time. After he left, Eleanor locked the schoolhouse and walked back to the boarding house through the gathering dusk. Her first day had been a disaster. Half the students barely knew their letters, the other half didn't want to be there, and she'd already made enemies of the 2 boys most likely to cause problems. But she was still here, still standing, and tomorrow she'd get up and do it again, running toward something, she reminded herself, even if she wasn't entirely sure what that something was yet. The second day was worse than the first. Tom and Jake arrived exactly on time, as promised, but their compliance was a thin veneer over simmering resentment. They sat in the back row, silent, arms crossed, staring at Eleanor with expressions that made it clear the war wasn't over. Every question she asked them was met with barely audible mumbles. Every assignment completed with the absolute minimum effort. They weren't disrupting class anymore, but they were making her work twice as hard to maintain order, and they knew it. By the end of the week, Eleanor felt like she was teaching in a minefield. The younger students were progressing. Little Emma Hartley could finally sound out simple words without crying, and the Dietrich twins had memorized their multiplication tables through 5. But the older students remained a constant challenge. And Tom and Jake's silent hostility had infected several other students who now looked at Eleanor with the same skeptical defiance. Friday afternoon, after the last student left, Eleanor sat at her desk with her head in her hands. Her lessons weren't working. Half the students were reading at different levels, which meant preparing multiple sets of materials for every class. The stove smoked constantly, filling the room with a haze that made everyone's eyes water. And she was exhausted in a way she'd never experienced in Philadelphia, where the most strenuous thing she'd done was arrange flowers for her mother's charity events. The door opened without warning. Eleanor looked up, expecting Sarah or Mrs. Foster. It was Riker Boone. He stood in the doorway holding a wooden crate, his coat dusted with snow that was just beginning to fall outside. Brought you something. Eleanor blinked. Mr. Boone, I wasn't expecting... Nobody expects me. That's how I like it. He walked to her desk and set down the crate. Margaret Dietrich said you needed more primers. Got these from a schoolhouse over in Laramie that closed down. Figured you could use them. Eleanor stood and looked into the crate. Books. At least 20 of them. Primers, readers, an atlas, even a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. This is incredibly generous. How much do I owe you? Nothing. They were collecting dust in someone's attic. He glanced around the classroom. Stove still smoking? Like a chimney. Riker walked over to the pot-bellied stove and crouched beside it, examining the flue. Damper's stuck. That's your problem. He pulled a knife from his belt and worked at something Eleanor couldn't see. There was a scraping sound, then a metallic clunk. Try it now. Eleanor added a log to the fire. The smoke that had been pouring into the room suddenly drew cleanly up the chimney. The relief was immediate. How did you know how to fix that? She asked. Fixed a lot of things over the years. He stood, wiping his hands on his pants. You settling in all right? Besides the smoking stove and the Brennan boys? Word really does travel quickly here. There's not much else to talk about in Red Hollow. New schoolteacher from Philadelphia is the most interesting thing that's happened since Henry Caulfield's saloon caught fire last spring. He paused. They giving you real trouble? Eleanor hesitated. Pride told her to say no, that she had everything under control. Honesty won out. They're testing me. I expected that. I just didn't expect it to be quite so exhausting. Teaching's hard work. Most people don't realize that until they try it. Riker picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a desk. My mother taught school before she married my father. She used to say the hardest part wasn't the lessons. It was convincing students they were worth educating. It was the first personal thing he'd shared. Eleanor found herself curious despite her exhaustion. Your mother was a teacher. In Missouri, before the war. She taught me and my brother to read before we were 5 years old. Said education was the only thing nobody could take from you. His expression went distant. She was wrong about that, as it turned out, but I still appreciated the reading. There was a story there, Eleanor thought, something painful. But before she could ask, Riker was already heading for the door. Anyway, books are yours. Let me know if the stove acts up again. Mr. Boone, Eleanor caught herself. Thank you, truly. For the books, for fixing the stove, for... She gestured vaguely at the classroom. All of it. He nodded once and left, pulling the door shut behind him. Through the window, Eleanor watched him climb onto his wagon and drive north toward his ranch, the snow falling heavier now, already starting to cover the road. She turned back to the crate of books and ran her fingers over the worn covers. In Philadelphia, books had been commonplace. Here, they were treasures. The fact that Riker had thought to bring them to her, had driven into town in the snow just to deliver them, felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate. That night at dinner, Sarah Brennan peppered Eleanor with questions about Riker's visit while the other boarders listened with barely concealed interest. He's never brought books to anyone before, Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Usually he just keeps to his ranch and only comes to town when he needs supplies. Mrs. Foster set down a platter of roasted chicken with more force than necessary. Leave the poor woman alone, Sarah. Riker's a good neighbor, that's all. But don't you think it's romantic? Sarah pressed. He saved her life and now he's bringing her gifts. Books aren't gifts, they're tools, one of the ranch hands interjected. And Miss Whitmore's here to teach, not catch a husband. Eleanor felt her face heat. Mr. Boone has been very kind, but there's nothing romantic about fixing a stove or delivering school books. Of course not, Mrs. Foster agreed, shooting Sarah a warning look. Now eat your dinner before it gets cold. But as Eleanor lay in bed that night, listening to the wind howl outside her window and watching snow pile up on the sill, she found herself thinking about Riker Boone anyway. Not romantically, that was absurd, she barely knew him, but curiously. He was unlike anyone she'd met in Philadelphia, quieter, more self-contained. The men she'd known back east had been full of talk and performance, always trying to impress. Riker just did things, fixed problems, helped without making a production of it. It was refreshing, and a little intimidating. The snow continued through Saturday and into Sunday, blanketing Red Hollow in white. Eleanor attended church services in the small chapel at the end of town, sitting with Mrs. Foster and trying to memorize the faces of the congregation. Most of the school families were there. The Dietrichs, the Hartleys, the Brennans, including Tom and Jake, who sat sullen and bored through the entire sermon. Riker wasn't there, she noticed. Somehow that didn't surprise her. After services, Margaret Dietrich cornered Eleanor outside. How was your first week? Challenging, Eleanor admitted, but I think we're making progress. Tom and Jake? They're testing boundaries. It's natural. Margaret's expression said she didn't buy that diplomatic answer. Those boys need a firm hand. Their father spoils them because their mother died when they were young. He thinks giving them everything they want makes up for losing her. It doesn't. She adjusted her shawl against the cold. Don't let them push you around, Miss Whitmore. The other students are watching. If you lose control now, you won't get it back. Eleanor thought about that advice all through the weekend. By Monday morning, she'd formulated a plan. When Tom and Jake arrived, she met them at the door. I need your help, she said. They looked immediately suspicious. Help with what? The younger students are struggling with reading. I need someone to work with them individually while I teach the older group. You two are the strongest readers in class. I'd like you to take charge of Emma and the Fletcher children. Tom's suspicion deepened. Why would we do that? Because teaching someone else is the best way to prove you've mastered the material yourself. And because I'm asking. Eleanor held his gaze. Unless you don't think you're capable. That got him. Tom's pride was bigger than his resentment. We can do it. Good. Start today. It wasn't a perfect solution. Tom and Jake were surly tutors at best, and Emma Fletcher burst into tears twice before noon. But it changed the dynamic. Instead of sitting in the back row radiating hostility, the boys were engaged, occupied, and slowly, grudgingly, they began to take the tutoring seriously. By Wednesday, Tom was actually praising Emma when she sounded out a difficult word correctly. By Friday, Jake had created a game to help the Fletcher children memorize their letters. They still didn't like Eleanor. That much was clear from their clipped responses and stubborn expressions, but they were no longer actively sabotaging her classroom. It felt like a victory. A small one, but Eleanor would take what she could get. November arrived with freezing temperatures and wind that cut like broken glass. Eleanor learned to dress in layers, to never go anywhere without her heaviest shawl, to keep her hands moving during lessons so they wouldn't go numb. The schoolhouse was perpetually cold despite the stove running constantly. The students huddled close to the fire during breaks, and Eleanor taught with her coat on more days than not. The rhythm of teaching began to feel almost natural. Morning lessons focused on basics, reading, writing, arithmetic. Afternoons were for history, geography, and science when she could manage it with their limited supplies. The younger students were progressing steadily. The older students remained more difficult, but Eleanor was learning to choose her battles. Some days were about education. Some days were just about survival. On a particularly cold Thursday, Eleanor dismissed class early when the stove began smoking again despite Riker's repairs. She was poking at the flue with a stick, trying to figure out what was wrong, when she heard a horse approaching. Not a wagon this time, just a rider. Eleanor looked out the window and saw Riker dismounting from a big roan gelding. He tied the horse to the rail and came inside, bringing a blast of cold air with him. Stove problems again? He asked without preamble. I think a bird built a nest in the chimney, or something died in there. It smells terrible. Riker went to the stove and opened the flue access. A rush of soot and dead leaves fell into the firebox. He reached up the chimney with his bare hand. Eleanor winced and pulled out a massive clump of debris. More soot, more leaves, and what looked like part of an old nest. There's your problem. He dumped it into the ash bucket. Chimney needs a cap. I'll bring one next time I'm in town. You don't have to keep fixing things for me. I know, but if I don't, you'll freeze or suffocate, and then Margaret Dietrich will never let me hear the end of it. He wiped his sooty hand on his pants, apparently unbothered by the mess. How's teaching going? Eleanor leaned against her desk. Better. The Brennan boys are actually helping with the younger students now. I think they might not hate me anymore. Progress? Slow progress. But yes. She hesitated. Can I ask you something? You just did. A small smile tugged at her mouth despite herself. Why do you keep helping me? You barely know me. Riker was quiet for a moment, looking at the stove rather than at her. You remind me of someone. My mother, maybe. Coming out here with nothing but determination and a teaching contract, trying to make something work against long odds. He glanced at her finally. I respect that. Did your mother succeed with her school? His expression went carefully neutral. For a while. Then the war came and everything fell apart. He picked up his hat. Anyway, I should get back. Cattle don't feed themselves. Wait. Eleanor wasn't sure what made her say it, but the words came out before she could stop them. Would you like to stay for coffee? I was going to make some before walking back to the boarding house. Riker looked surprised. You have coffee here? Mrs. Foster gave me a tin to keep at the school. Says I'll need it to survive winter. Eleanor moved to the small table in the corner where she kept a battered pot and a few supplies. It won't be fancy, but it'll be hot. He hesitated, clearly torn between leaving and staying. Finally, he nodded. All right, coffee sounds good. Eleanor pumped water from the schoolyard well and set the pot on the still warm stove. While it heated, she cleared books off 2 student desks and pulled them into a semblance of a conversation area. Riker sat, looking faintly ridiculous on the small chair, his long legs barely fitting under the desk. How long have you had your ranch? Eleanor asked, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. 10 years. Bought the land cheap from a man who couldn't make it work. Everyone said I was crazy, too isolated, not enough water, winter's too harsh. He shrugged. Maybe I was crazy, but I made it work. What made you come out here? To Wyoming. Same as everyone else, looking for something or running from something. He said it lightly, but Eleanor heard the weight behind the words. The war. Among other things. Riker didn't elaborate, and Eleanor didn't push. She poured 2 cups of coffee. It was strong enough to strip paint, the way Mrs. Foster made it, and handed one to him. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee in a cold schoolhouse while wind rattled the windows. It should have been awkward. Instead, it felt strangely comfortable. Riker wasn't a man who needed to fill silence with talking. Eleanor appreciated that. Most of the men she'd known in Philadelphia had been relentlessly chatty, as if quiet made them nervous. Can I ask you something now? Riker said finally. That's only fair. What are you running from? Eleanor wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into her cold fingers. She could deflect, change the subject, but something about Riker's quiet directness made evasion feel dishonest. An arranged marriage, she said. My father lost everything gambling. He had debts he couldn't pay. A man named Richard Thornton offered to clear those debts if I agreed to marry him. And you didn't want to marry him. He was 43. I was 19. He'd been married twice before. Both wives died in childbirth. Eleanor stared into her coffee. My father said I was being selfish, that I was ruining the family. Maybe he was right. He wasn't right. Riker's voice was flat, certain. Marrying someone you don't want to marry, someone who'd use you to settle a debt, that's not selfishness. That's survival instinct. You did the right thing running. Eleanor looked up, surprised by his vehemence. You sound very sure about that. I am sure. My brother married for duty. My father pressured him into it. The woman was older, wealthy, connected. My brother was miserable every day of that marriage. When she died 3 years in, he said it was like being released from prison. Riker set down his coffee cup. Nobody should have to live like that. Not for debt, not for family, not for anything. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the schoolhouse corners. The afternoon light was fading. Eleanor realized she'd lost track of time. I should get back before dark, she said reluctantly. Riker stood, his head nearly brushing the low ceiling. I'll ride alongside you. Snow's supposed to start again tonight. Don't want you caught out in it. I can manage the walk. It's not far. I know, but I'm riding that direction anyway. It was almost certainly a lie. His ranch was north, the boarding house was south, but Eleanor didn't argue. They cleaned up the coffee things, banked the fire in the stove, and locked up the schoolhouse. Outside, the temperature had dropped even further. Eleanor's breath came out in white clouds. Riker untied his horse and led it, while walking beside Eleanor down the main street. The town was quiet, most people already inside for the evening. Smoke rose from chimneys, light glowed in windows. It looked almost cozy if you ignored the brutal cold. Do you ever miss Philadelphia? Riker asked. Sometimes. I miss my mother. She died 3 years ago. After that, the city felt less like home and more like a trap. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter. What about you? Do you miss Missouri? No. There's nothing there for me anymore. His tone made it clear that subject was closed. They reached the boarding house too quickly. Riker stopped at the front steps. Get inside before you freeze. Thank you for walking with me and for fixing the stove. Again. I'll bring that chimney cap next week. Eleanor climbed the steps, then turned back.
Mr. Boone? Why did you really help me that first night, when you found me on the road?
He looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable in the fading light. Because leaving someone to freeze in the dark is the kind of thing you can't come back from, and I've done enough things I can't come back from already. Before she could respond, he swung up onto his horse and rode away, disappearing into the twilight. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching until she couldn't see him anymore, wondering what exactly he'd meant by that. Inside, Mrs. Foster had dinner waiting, venison stew and fresh bread. Sarah was full of questions about Riker's visit, but Eleanor deflected them as smoothly as she could. After dinner, she retreated to her room and tried to focus on preparing tomorrow's lessons. But her mind kept drifting back to the conversation in the schoolhouse. The coffee. The easy silence. The way Riker had said she'd done the right thing running, as if there was no question about it. She barely knew him, but somehow, when he said things like that, she believed him. The next week brought the first real snowstorm of the season. It started Friday afternoon as a few lazy flakes, and by evening had turned into a blinding wall of white. School let out early. Eleanor helped the families who lived closest gather their children and hurry home before the storm got worse. The last to leave were the Dietrich twins, collected by their father, who gave Eleanor a grim nod. "Get yourself home quick, Miss Whitmore. This one's going to be bad." Eleanor locked up and started for the boarding house. The wind was already vicious, cutting through her coat like it wasn't there. Snow stung her face. By the time she reached Mrs. Foster's, she could barely feel her feet. The storm lasted 3 days. Snow piled up against buildings until the drifts were taller than Eleanor. The temperature dropped so low that water left in basins overnight froze solid. Mrs. Foster kept the fires roaring. The boarders huddled inside, playing cards and telling stories and waiting for the weather to break. On the third night, someone pounded on the front door. Mrs. Foster opened it to find Riker Boone standing in the snow, leading his horse. "Need to stable my horse," he said, his voice rough. "Can't make it back to the ranch. Roads are impassable." Of course. Mrs. Foster ushered him inside. "Put the horse in the shed out back. There's hay in the corner. Then get yourself warm." Riker disappeared into the storm. 10 minutes later, he was back, covered in snow, his face red from cold. Mrs. Foster immediately pressed a cup of hot coffee into his hands and pushed him toward the fire. Eleanor, who'd been reading in the corner, watched as he stripped off his coat and gloves. His hands were shaking from the cold. How long had he been out in that storm? "What were you doing out there?" Mrs. Foster demanded, hands on her hips. "Nobody with sense travels in weather like this." "Checking on the Hartley place. Ben's got a bad leg. Wanted to make sure they had enough firewood." Riker wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "They were running low. I chopped enough to get them through. In a blizzard. Seemed important." Mrs. Foster shook her head but didn't argue. She went to get blankets and prepare the small spare room she kept for emergencies. Riker stayed by the fire, slowly thawing. Eleanor stood and moved closer. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Just cold. You could have died out there." He looked at her, his brown eyes steady. "Ben Hartley's 70 years old with a bum leg. He wouldn't have lasted 2 days without heat. Sometimes you take the risk." It was such a simple statement, no bravado, no seeking praise, just a matter-of-fact acceptance of what needed to be done. Eleanor found herself staring at him, trying to understand what kind of man rode out into a killing blizzard to chop firewood for an old man with a bad leg. Mrs. Foster returned with blankets and a bowl of leftover stew. "You'll stay tonight. Storm's not letting up. Don't even think about arguing." Riker didn't argue. He ate the stew, drank more coffee, and eventually let Mrs. Foster show him to the spare room. The other boarders had already retreated upstairs. Eleanor should have done the same, but she lingered by the fire, staring into the flames and thinking about risks and choices, and men who didn't leave people to freeze in the dark. The storm finally broke on the 4th day. Red Hollow emerged into blinding sunshine and snowdrifts that had completely transformed the landscape. Roads were buried. Buildings were half disappeared under white mounds. It would take days to dig out. Eleanor walked to the schoolhouse with Riker, who'd insisted on clearing a path for her before heading back to his ranch. They worked in silence, shoveling snow away from the door, checking for damage. The chimney cap Riker had promised to bring sat on the roof now, installed sometime before the storm hit. Eleanor hadn't even noticed. "When did you put that up?" she asked. "Last week. Didn't mention it because I figured you'd feel obligated to thank me, and that gets tiresome for both of us. He leaned on his shovel. School's probably going to be closed for a few days while people dig out. Good chance to catch up on lesson planning. Or I could help with the digging. Riker looked surprised. You don't have to do that. I know, but I'm part of this town now. That means helping when help's needed. Eleanor met his gaze. You taught me that. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. All right then, we'll start with the Hartleys. Ben could use another set of hands clearing his roof before the weight caves it in. They spent the next 3 days helping dig out Red Hollow. Eleanor had never done manual labor like this in her life. In Philadelphia, ladies didn't shovel snow or clear roofs or haul firewood. They stayed inside and let servants handle such things. Here, everyone worked. Eleanor's hands blistered. Her back ached. She fell into bed each night too exhausted to even dream. But there was something deeply satisfying about it. Something real. She was doing work that mattered, work that kept people alive through the winter. And she was doing it alongside Riker, who worked with the steady endurance of someone who'd been surviving harsh conditions his entire life. By the time school reopened, Eleanor felt like she understood Red Hollow in a way she hadn't before. She'd seen inside people's homes, met their families, shared meals around rough-hewn tables. The town wasn't just a teaching assignment anymore. It was becoming something else, something that felt dangerously close to home. Classes resumed with most students present, though a few families who lived farther out were still snowed in. Eleanor threw herself back into teaching, using techniques she'd learned from watching Tom and Jake work with the younger students. Break complicated lessons into smaller pieces. Use repetition. Make it into games when possible. Praise effort as much as results. It was working. Slowly, incrementally, but working. Emma Hartley could now read simple sentences. The Dietrich twins were doing multiplication in their heads. Even the older students who'd been most resistant were showing improvement. One afternoon in late November, Margaret Dietrich stopped by after school. I wanted to tell you how impressed the committee is with your progress. The students are learning more in 2 months with you than they did in a year with the last teacher. Eleanor felt a flush of pride. Thank you. They're good students. They just needed structure and consistency. And a teacher who doesn't give up when things get difficult. Margaret paused. I also wanted to mention that there's a town gathering next Saturday night. Nothing fancy, just supper and dancing at the community hall. You should come. I don't know, I have lesson planning. You need a break from lesson planning. You've been working yourself to the bone since you arrived. Come, eat, dance if you want, or just sit and visit with people. Margaret's smile turned knowing. I hear Riker Boone might even make an appearance. He usually avoids these things, but Ben Hartley's been working on him. Eleanor tried not to react to that information and failed miserably, judging by Margaret's expression. I'll think about it. You do that. Saturday arrived cold and clear. Eleanor spent the morning preparing the week's lessons, then the afternoon helping Mrs. Foster with mending. By evening, she'd almost convinced herself not to go to the gathering. She didn't have an appropriate dress. She'd be exhausted tomorrow. She had work to do. But Sarah Brennan showed up at her door at 6 o'clock, dressed in her best calico and radiating determination. You're coming. I won't take no for an answer. You've been in Red Hollow 2 months and you've barely socialized with anyone outside the school committee. I've been busy. Too busy. Come on. Mrs. Foster already said she'd lend you her blue dress, the one with the lace collar. It'll fit you perfect. Eleanor let herself be bullied into it. She changed into Mrs. Foster's dress, which did fit perfectly, and let Sarah arrange her hair into something more elaborate than her usual practical bun. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked younger, less severe, almost pretty. The community hall was warm and crowded and smelled like roasted meat and fresh bread. Long tables held enough food to feed an army: venison stew, roasted chicken, potatoes, biscuits, pies, cakes. Someone had brought a fiddle. Someone else had a harmonica. People were already dancing, spinning, and laughing with the easy camaraderie of folks who'd survived another season together. Eleanor stood near the door, suddenly overwhelmed. In Philadelphia, she'd attended countless balls and parties, but this felt different, more intimate, more real. These people worked together,
helped each other survive, knew each other's struggles and triumphs. She was still an outsider looking in. You made it. She turned. Riker stood beside her, cleaned up in a way she'd never seen him. Fresh shirt, hair combed, beard neatly trimmed. He looked uncomfortable in the crowd, but he'd shown up anyway. Sarah dragged me here, Eleanor admitted. Ben Hartley did the same to me. Riker glanced around the hall. I usually avoid these things. Too many people, too much noise. Then why come? Ben said I've been a hermit long enough. Said it wasn't natural for a man to spend all his time alone with cattle and horses. He looked at her. Apparently I need to socialize more. Eleanor smiled. I've been told the same thing.
They stood together in companionable silence while the party swirled around them. Margaret Dietrich waved from across the room. Sarah was already dancing with one of the ranch hands. Children ran between tables, laughing and shrieking. It was chaotic and loud and somehow wonderful. You want to dance? Riker asked suddenly, as if the words surprised him as much as they surprised Eleanor. I didn't think you danced. I don't. Not well, anyway. But Ben said standing in the corner all night defeats the purpose of coming. Eleanor's heart did something complicated in her chest. All right. Yes, I'd like that. He led her to the edge of the dancing area, where they'd be less likely to crash into anyone. The fiddler started a new song, a simple waltz. Riker put one hand on her waist, took her hand with the other, and they began to move. He wasn't lying about not dancing well. His steps were uncertain, his rhythm slightly off. But Eleanor didn't care. She was acutely aware of his hand warm against her waist, his rough palm against hers, the way he was looking at her like she was the only person in the room. You're staring, she said softly. Am I? Yes. Sorry, you look different tonight. Nice. Eleanor felt her cheeks heat. Thank you. They turned awkwardly, nearly colliding with another couple. Riker caught her, steadying her, and they both laughed. Quick, surprised bursts of sound. It felt good, natural, like something loosening in Eleanor's chest that had been tight for years. When the song ended, they didn't immediately separate. They stood close, still holding hands, while the fiddler started something faster and other couples swept past them. Thank you for the dance, Eleanor said. Thank you for not laughing at my terrible dancing. It wasn't terrible. It was earnest. Riker smiled, a real smile this time, not just the ghost of one. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger and more open. Eleanor's breath caught. Before either of them could say anything else, Tom Brennan appeared beside them with a plate of food. Miss Whitmore, my ma wanted me to bring you this. Says you're too skinny. Eleanor accepted the plate, amused. Thank you, Tom. That's very thoughtful. Tom looked between her and Riker with the too perceptive eyes of a 16-year-old. You two courting or something? Tom, Eleanor said firmly, that's inappropriate. Just asking. He grinned and disappeared back into the crowd. Riker shook his head. That boy has no filter. No, but he's not wrong about people wondering. Let them wonder. Doesn't change anything. Except it did, Eleanor thought. Or it could. She wasn't sure which option scared her more. They spent the rest of the evening together, not dancing again but sitting at one of the tables, eating and watching the festivities. People came by to chat, mostly with Eleanor asking about the school, but occasionally with Riker too. He was polite but brief, clearly more comfortable listening than talking. As the night wore on and children started falling asleep on their parents' laps, the crowd began to thin. Riker walked Eleanor back to the boarding house, the cold November air a shock after the warmth of the hall. That wasn't as terrible as I expected, he said as they reached her door. High praise from you. I'm not big on social gatherings. Too much talking, not enough doing, but tonight was decent. Eleanor turned to face him on the porch. Can I ask you something? Seems to be your favorite question. Why do you keep showing up? Fixing my stove, bringing books, walking me home? You could just stay at your ranch and leave me to figure things out on my own. Riker was quiet for a long moment, his breath misting in the cold air. Because you're trying to do something good here. Teaching those kids, giving them a chance at something better. That's worth supporting. And because... He stopped, then continued more quietly. Because I don't want you to fail. Why not? Because if you fail, it'll be because nobody helped you. Because people left you to handle it alone.
And I've been left alone to handle things I wasn't ready for, and I know what that feels like. His eyes met hers. You don't deserve that. Eleanor's throat tightened. Nobody in Philadelphia had ever said anything like that to her. Nobody had cared whether she succeeded or failed beyond how it affected them. Thank you, she said softly. For all of it. Riker nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. Eleanor, Miss Whitmore, you're doing good work here. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Not the Brennan boys, not the school committee, not anyone. He left before she could respond, walking back toward the livery stable where his horse was kept. Eleanor stood on the porch long after he'd disappeared, her heart beating too fast, her mind spinning. Something was happening between them, something she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she knew how to handle. In Philadelphia, courtship had been formal and calculated, driven by family expectations and social position. This felt different, unplanned, real, and terrifying. Because if she let herself care about Riker Boone, if she let herself believe in the possibility of something growing between them, and it all fell apart, the pain would be devastating. She'd come to Red Hollow to escape one kind of trap. She couldn't afford to fall into another. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, Eleanor couldn't shake the memory of his hand on her waist, his steady brown eyes looking at her like she mattered, his quiet voice saying she didn't deserve to fail. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd made the right choice after all. December arrived with temperatures so brutal that Eleanor's water pitcher froze solid overnight despite being kept indoors. She woke each morning to frost patterns on her window thick enough to obscure the view, dressed in layers until she could barely move, and walked to the schoolhouse through air that hurt to breathe. The students came bundled in everything their families owned, coats over sweaters over shirts, scarves wrapped around faces until only their eyes showed, mittens so thick they could barely hold pencils. Teaching in winter was a different challenge entirely. The stove roared constantly but only heated a small radius around itself. Eleanor moved lessons in shifts, younger students near the fire for reading, older students at the back for arithmetic, then switching. Everyone's fingers were too cold to write neatly. Ink froze in the inkwells, pages stuck together with frost. Some days Eleanor wondered if they were learning anything at all or just trying not to freeze. But they kept coming. That was the thing that surprised her most. Even on the worst days, when the wind howled like something alive and snow piled up overnight, the students arrived. Sometimes late, always cold, but there. Their families valued education enough to send them out into killing weather. Eleanor couldn't let them down. She saw Riker less frequently now that winter had truly set in. He came to town for supplies every week or so, usually stopped by the schoolhouse to check that the stove was working. But the visits were brief. Ranch work in winter was brutal, feeding cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, checking constantly for signs of sickness or injury in the herd. He looked more tired each time she saw him, his face weathered darker, new lines around his eyes. Still, he always asked how she was managing, always made sure she had enough firewood stacked behind the schoolhouse. And once, when Eleanor mentioned that her boots were wearing through and she was worried about affording new ones before the worst of winter hit, a package appeared on her doorstep 2 days later. Inside, sturdy leather boots lined with fur, sized perfectly for her feet. No note, no signature. But Eleanor knew. She tried to return them. Riker refused to discuss it. "Consider it a Christmas present," he said when she cornered him outside the general store. "Christmas is 3 weeks away. So I'm early. Don't make it complicated." "Riker, these cost at least $15. I can't accept." "You can, and you will, because your old boots have holes in them and you're going to lose toes to frostbite if you keep wearing them." His tone left no room for argument. Sometimes accepting help isn't weakness. It's survival. Remember that. He walked away before she could protest further. Eleanor stood in the freezing street, holding the package, torn between gratitude and frustration. She wasn't used to accepting charity. In Philadelphia, accepting gifts from men who weren't family had been inappropriate, suggestive of obligations she didn't want. But this didn't feel like that. It felt like Riker had seen a problem and solved it, the way he approached everything else. That night, Eleanor wrote him a thank you note. She went through 4 drafts before settling on something that felt honest without being too revealing. She left it at the general store where Riker picked up his mail. Whether he read it or not, she never knew. He didn't mention it the next time she saw him. The week before Christmas, the school committee asked Eleanor to organize a holiday program, students performing songs and recitations for their families. In Philadelphia, such events had been elaborate affairs with printed programs and catered refreshments. Here, Eleanor had 2 weeks to prepare, limited materials, and students who'd never performed in front of an audience. She threw herself into planning with the same determination she brought to everything else. The older students would recite poetry. The younger ones would sing carols. Emma Hartley, who had a surprisingly sweet voice, would perform a solo. They'd practice during the last hour of each school day, transforming the cold classroom into something that felt almost festive. Tom and Jake Brennan surprised her by volunteering to build a small stage from scrap lumber. They worked on it after school, hammering and sawing with more enthusiasm than Eleanor had seen from them all semester. When she asked why they were helping, Tom shrugged. "Guess we figure you've worked hard for us. Seems fair to work hard for you too." It was the closest thing to an apology she'd get from them, and it meant more than they probably realized. The night of the program arrived with clear skies and manageable cold. Families packed into the schoolhouse until there was barely room to breathe. Mrs. Foster came, bringing cookies she'd baked specially. Sarah Brennan helped arrange chairs. Martin Dietrich stood near the door, beaming with pride as his twins prepared to recite their multiplication tables as a demonstration of their progress. Eleanor scanned the crowd as parents settled into seats, looking for one face in particular. When she spotted Riker standing in the back corner, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral, something settled in her chest. He'd come. Despite hating crowds, despite having 1,000 things to do at the ranch, he'd come. The program went better than Eleanor had dared hope. The younger students sang carols with more enthusiasm than accuracy, but nobody cared. The Dietrich twins flawlessly recited multiplication tables, earning applause from their proud father. Tom Brennan delivered a surprisingly moving reading from Washington Irving, and Emma Hartley's solo, a simple carol about winter stars, left several mothers dabbing at their eyes. When it was over, parents crowded around Eleanor to thank her. Margaret Dietrich squeezed her hand. "You've done wonders with these children. Wonders." Ben Hartley, leaning on his cane, nodded agreement. "Emma couldn't even read when you got here. Now listen to her. You've got a gift, Miss Whitmore." The praise felt overwhelming. Eleanor had spent so much of the past 3 months doubting herself, wondering if she was truly making a difference. That having these families confirm her work mattered left her momentarily speechless. After most people had left, Eleanor found Riker still standing in the corner, watching her clean up. He stepped forward to help, collecting scattered pages of song lyrics while she wiped down the blackboard. "The children did well," he said. "They worked hard." "So did you." He set the papers on her desk. "You've changed this school. My mother would have approved." Coming from Riker, who rarely spoke of his mother, the compliment felt significant. Eleanor stopped cleaning and looked at him. "Thank you for coming. I know you don't enjoy crowds." "I don't, but I wanted to see what you'd built here." He gestured at the classroom. "Turns out it was worth the discomfort." They finished cleaning in companionable silence. When everything was ready for Monday's lessons, Eleanor locked the schoolhouse and they walked together down the dark street. Most houses showed lit windows. Somewhere someone was playing a fiddle, practicing Christmas music. The air smelled like wood smoke and pine. "Will you spend Christmas at the ranch?" Eleanor asked. "Same as every year. Feed the cattle, check the fences, make sure nothing freezes that shouldn't." "Alone? I prefer it that way." Eleanor wanted to argue, to tell him that nobody should be alone on Christmas, but she stopped herself. Riker had made his choices for reasons she didn't fully understand. It wasn't her place to question them. At the boarding house steps, he paused. "What about you? How do Whitmore women spend Christmas?" "In Philadelphia, we'd attend services at church, then have a formal dinner with extended family. My mother always insisted on giving gifts to the household staff, small things, but personal. She said Christmas was about remembering that everyone deserves dignity and kindness." Eleanor's throat tightened. "This will be my 3rd Christmas without her. It doesn't get easier." "No, it doesn't." Riker's voice was quiet. "But you honor her memory by teaching those kids the way she taught you, by giving them the same dignity and kindness she believed in. That matters." Before Eleanor could respond, he tipped his hat and walked away into the darkness. She stood on the porch, wrapped in the cold night, wondering how Riker always seemed to know exactly what she needed to hear. Christmas came and went quietly. Eleanor spent the day with Mrs. Foster and the other boarders, sharing a modest meal and exchanging small gifts. Sarah gave her a handkerchief she'd embroidered. Eleanor gave Sarah a book of poetry she'd brought from Philadelphia. It was peaceful, if a bit lonely. The day after Christmas, Eleanor returned to the schoolhouse to prepare lessons for the new year. She found a package waiting on her desk. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the kind used for lesson planning, with thick pages and a ribbon bookmark. The leather was tooled with an intricate pattern of leaves and vines. It was beautiful and practical and must have cost more than Riker could easily afford. A note lay inside, written in careful, blocky handwriting. For recording lessons and thoughts, every teacher needs one. R.B. Eleanor sat at her desk, running her fingers over the tooled leather, and tried not to cry. In Philadelphia, she'd received expensive gifts from suitors, jewelry, flowers, books of poetry chosen more for their impressive bindings than their content. Those gifts had felt like transactions, investments meant to secure her favor. This felt different. This felt like Riker had paid attention to what she actually needed and found something that would make her work easier. It was thoughtful in a way that had nothing to do with courtship and everything to do with seeing her as a person worth supporting. She wrote him another thank you note that evening. This one was shorter, more direct. Thank you for the journal. It's perfect. And thank you for seeing me as more than just the school teacher. It means more than you probably realize. E. She left it at the general store and tried not to obsess over whether she'd said too much. The new year arrived with a January blizzard that made November's storm look gentle by comparison. Snow fell for 6 days straight. Drifts buried first-floor windows. The temperature dropped so low that Eleanor's breath froze in her lungs when she tried to go outside. School closed. The entire town shut down, everyone hunkering in their homes and praying the food and firewood lasted. On the third day of the storm, Mrs. Foster announced they were running low on firewood. The other boarders looked grim. Without heat, they'd freeze before the storm ended. Eleanor, who'd been reading by candlelight to preserve lamp oil, looked up. "Where's the nearest supply?" "Storage shed behind the church," one of the ranch hands said. "But it's 3 streets away in this weather. Nobody's going out there." "We'll freeze if we don't." "We'll freeze if we do. That wind'll kill you in minutes." They were still arguing when someone pounded on the door. Mrs. Foster opened it to find Riker covered in snow, barely visible in the whiteout, hauling a sled loaded with firewood. "Heard you were running low," he shouted over the wind. He dragged the sled inside, snow cascading off his coat. His face was red and raw from cold. Ice clung to his beard. Mrs. Foster stared. "Riker Boone, you absolute fool. You could have died getting here." "Probably, but you need wood." He began unloading logs, stacking them efficiently near the fireplace. "This should last you until the storm breaks. I'll check back in 2 days." "You're not going back out there," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "You'll freeze before you make it to the end of the street." Riker looked at her, snow melting in his hair. "My ranch can wait. Your cattle are tougher than you give them credit for. And if you die trying to get back, they'll starve anyway when nobody finds your frozen body until spring." Eleanor crossed her arms. "You're staying here. Mrs. Foster has a spare room. She used it during the last storm. I was fine. And you'll be fine this time too. Stop arguing." For a moment, Riker looked like he might protest further. Then he glanced around at the expectant faces watching him, Mrs. Foster, the other boarders, Eleanor, and sighed. "All right, but only until the storm breaks." It took 3 more days. 3 days of being trapped inside with limited space, dwindling food supplies, and rising tension as everyone's nerves frayed from confinement. The boarders played endless card games. Mrs. Foster rationed meals carefully. Eleanor read aloud from books to pass the time. And Riker, after spending the first day restless and uncomfortable, finally settled into helping. He repaired a broken chair, fixed a drafty window, taught one of the younger ranch hands how to whittle, small things that made the forced proximity more bearable. Eleanor found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice, the way his hands moved with unconscious competence, always finding something useful to do. The way he listened more than he talked, but when he did speak, people paid attention. The way he seemed most comfortable when working, as if stillness made him nervous. On the fourth night, when everyone else had gone to bed, Eleanor found him sitting alone by the dying fire, staring into the embers. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly. He glanced up. "Too used to ranch quiet. All these people in one place sets my teeth on edge." Eleanor sat in the chair across from him. "Then why did you come check on us? You could have stayed safely at your ranch and let us manage."
Because managing isn't the same as surviving, and because he stopped, jaw working like he was trying to decide whether to continue. Because I already lost people I cared about by not being there when they needed help. I won't make that mistake again. The pain in his voice was raw enough that Eleanor didn't push for details. Instead, she said, "For what it's worth, I'm glad you came, even if it makes you uncomfortable." "Are you?"
"Yes. You risked your life to bring us firewood. That's not nothing." Riker looked at her across the dim space. The firelight caught his face in sharp relief, highlighting the weathering and scars and exhaustion. "You would have done the same. You're not the type to let people suffer when you can help." "How do you know that?" "Because you left everything you knew to teach children you'd never met. Because you walked 3 miles in the dark rather than give up. Because you spent days helping dig out the town after the November storm when you didn't have to." His voice was steady, certain. "You're a lot tougher than you think you are, Eleanor Whitmore." Hearing him use her first name sent a shock through her. He'd been carefully formal since they met, always Miss Whitmore, maintaining proper distance. This felt like a barrier dropping. "Eleanor?" she said. "Just Eleanor is fine. When it's just us." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but warmer. "All right, Eleanor." They sat in silence, watching the fire burn down to coals. Outside the wind howled, but inside it was warm and quiet, and strangely peaceful. Eleanor felt her eyes growing heavy, lulled by the heat and the long days of tension finally easing. She must have dozed off, because when she opened her eyes, someone had draped a blanket over her shoulders, and the fire had been built back up. Riker was gone, but the warmth lingered where he'd been sitting. The storm finally broke on the 5th day. Red Hollow emerged into sunshine so bright it hurt to look at, and snowdrifts that had completely reshaped the landscape. It took another week for the town to dig out enough to resume normal life. School reopened to students who'd been cooped up too long and arrived with restless energy that made teaching nearly impossible. But they were there. They were alive. And so was Eleanor. Riker left the morning after the storm broke, heading back to his ranch to assess damage and check on his herd. He stopped by the boarding house before leaving, pulling Eleanor aside briefly. "Thank you for making me stay," he said. "I would have tried to make it back and probably died halfway. You were right. I'm glad you listened. I don't do that often, listen to people." He adjusted his hat. "But I'm working on it." After he left, Sarah cornered Eleanor in the parlor. "You two are courting, aren't you?" "We're friends." "Friends who look at each other like that?" Eleanor felt her face heat. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Sarah's expression turned more serious. "Just be careful, Eleanor. Riker's a good man, but he's been alone a long time. He's not easy to know, and winter out here is hard enough without complicated feelings making it harder." Eleanor wanted to argue, but Sarah wasn't wrong. What she felt for Riker was becoming complicated in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd come to Red Hollow to escape one kind of entanglement. Getting caught up in another, no matter how different it felt, was dangerous. The problem was, she wasn't sure she wanted to stop. Late January brought a brief warm spell that melted some of the snow and gave everyone false hope that winter might be ending early. Eleanor took advantage of the milder weather to organize a skating party for the students on the frozen pond outside town. Most of the children had never ice skated before, but they threw themselves into it with the fearless enthusiasm of youth. Eleanor, who'd learned to skate on the ponds in Philadelphia's parks, helped the younger ones find their balance while the older students raced each other across the ice. It was chaos and laughter and several spectacular falls, but nobody got seriously hurt and everyone went home happy. She was helping pack up the borrowed skates when she heard a horse approaching. Riker rode up, dismounted, and looked at the pond with something like amusement. "Heard you were teaching skating now in addition to reading and arithmetic." Seemed like a good use of the warm weather. Eleanor handed him a pair of skates to carry. "You just happened to be passing by?" I just happened to want to make sure nobody drowned falling through the ice. The ice is 2 feet thick. Still, he loaded the skates onto his horse. You want to ride back to town? Save you the walk. Eleanor hesitated. Riding with Riker would mean sitting very close to him on the horse. It would also mean saving her feet, which were frozen despite her good boots. Practicality won out. All right, thank you. He helped her mount, then swung up behind her. His arm came around her waist to hold the reins, and Eleanor was suddenly acutely aware of the solid warmth of him at her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his body moved with the horse's gait. They rode in silence for a while. The late afternoon sun turned the snow-covered landscape golden. In the distance, mountains rose sharp against the pale sky. It was beautiful in a way that still took Eleanor's breath away, vast and wild, and completely unlike Philadelphia's manicured parks. Do you miss the city? Riker asked, his voice close to her ear. Sometimes. I miss theaters and bookstores and sidewalks that don't turn into mud or ice depending on the weather. Eleanor paused. But I don't miss the life I would have had there. The expectations, the constant performance of being someone I wasn't. Who were you performing as? The dutiful daughter, the acceptable match, the woman who smiled and agreed and never caused problems. She watched the landscape roll past. I was good at it, too good. I think that's why my father was so angry when I left. I'd played the part so well, he forgot I was acting. Riker's arm tightened slightly around her waist. You're not acting now. No, I'm not. Eleanor leaned back slightly, letting herself rest against him. It was forward, probably inappropriate, but she was tired of always worrying about what was appropriate. Thank you for that, for letting me be myself without judgment. Nothing to thank me for. You're the one doing all the work. They reached town as the sun touched the horizon. Riker helped Eleanor down in front of the boarding house, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. Their eyes met, and Eleanor saw something in his expression that made her heart stutter, want, mixed with caution, mixed with something that looked like fear. Eleanor? He started, then stopped, shook his head. Never mind. What? Nothing. It's not. I should go. Ranch work. He rode away before she could press him, leaving Eleanor standing on the porch with more questions than answers. Something had almost happened there. Some admission or confession that Riker had pulled back from at the last moment. Sarah's warning echoed in her mind. Winter out here is hard enough without complicated feelings making it harder. Too late, Eleanor thought. The feelings were already complicated, and getting more so every day. February arrived with temperatures that made January look mild. The cold was so intense that breathing hurt, that exposed skin froze in minutes, that water thrown into the air turned to ice before hitting the ground. School became an exercise in survival, keeping students warm enough to function, preventing frostbite, making sure everyone got home safely before dark. Eleanor pushed through it the way she pushed through everything else, one day at a time, one lesson at a time, refusing to let the brutal weather break her. But she was tired, bone-deep tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. And she missed Riker, who she barely saw now that leaving the ranch meant risking death in the cold. Then came the day that changed everything. It started like any other. Eleanor arrived at the schoolhouse early, lit the stove, prepared lessons. Students trickled in, bundled and shivering. Tom and Jake Brennan were absent. Their mother had sent a note saying they were helping their father with emergency cattle work. Several other students were missing too. By 9 o'clock, Eleanor had only 8 students instead of her usual 15. They made it through morning lessons. Eleanor was teaching geography, reading about tropical climates, while everyone huddled near the stove felt almost cruelly ironic when she noticed the light outside changing. The pale winter sun was disappearing behind clouds that looked thick and dark and ominous. By noon it was snowing. Not the gentle flakes that had become routine, but big wet clumps that fell fast and thick, driven by wind that rattled the windows. Eleanor dismissed the students who lived closest, sending them home quickly before the weather worsened. But Emma Hartley and 2 of the Fletcher children lived farther out, and their parents had planned to collect them at the usual 3 o'clock dismissal. By 1 o'clock, visibility was nearly zero. The storm had gone from bad to catastrophic in less than an hour.
Eleanor couldn't see the building across the street anymore, just white, endless white, and wind that screamed around the schoolhouse corners. She gathered the 3 remaining students near the stove. "We're staying here until your parents come. The storm's too dangerous to try walking home." Emma nodded, wide-eyed. The Fletcher children huddled together. They were scared, but they trusted Eleanor to keep them safe. The afternoon crawled by. Eleanor kept the fire roaring, burning through firewood faster than she should have, but unable to risk the alternative. She distracted the children with stories, with word games, with anything that kept them from thinking about the storm outside or their parents who should have arrived by now. By 4 o'clock, the light was failing, and Eleanor was starting to worry seriously. The temperature inside the schoolhouse was dropping despite the fire. They were running low on wood, and nobody had come. By 5 o'clock, it was fully dark, and the cold was becoming dangerous. Eleanor had put every spare coat and blanket she could find on the children, but they were still shivering. The stove was down to embers because she had to ration the remaining wood. If they were stuck here overnight, they might not survive until morning. Emma started crying quietly. "I want my grandpa."
"I know, sweetheart. He'll come as soon as he can." Eleanor hoped she sounded more confident than she felt. Ben Hartley was 70 with a bad leg. He wouldn't try traveling in this, which meant Emma was stuck here until the storm passed or someone else came. The Fletcher children weren't crying, but they were too quiet, huddling together with that glassy-eyed stillness that came from being too cold for too long. Eleanor added the last of the firewood to the stove and tried not to think about what happened when it ran out. Tried not to think about the fact that nobody knew they were stranded here, that the storm could last all night, that by morning they might all be... Something hit the door hard enough to shake it in its frame. Eleanor's heart leaped. She rushed to the door and wrestled it open against the wind. A figure stumbled inside, covered in snow, barely recognizable. Riker. He fell to his knees, ice clinging to his beard, his face raw and bleeding where the wind had flayed him. "Thank Christ! I thought—" He couldn't finish. He was shaking too hard. Eleanor slammed the door shut and dropped to her knees beside him. "What are you doing here? You could have died." Ben Hartley came to the ranch. Said Emma was still at school. Said nobody could get through the storm to reach you. Riker's teeth were chattering. "I left immediately. Took me 2 hours to ride 3 miles. You're insane." "Probably." He looked past her at the 3 children staring with wide eyes. "Everyone all right? Cold? Scared? Running out of firewood." Riker struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. Eleanor grabbed his arm to steady him. He was frozen solid, his coat stiff with ice. How he'd made it here alive was a miracle. "There's emergency wood stored behind the church," he said. "Should be enough to last through the night. I'll get it." "You're not going back out there. You can barely stand." "Then we freeze." He was right, and Eleanor hated it. She wanted to argue, to tell him he'd done enough. But the children needed heat, and she couldn't let pride or fear stop her from accepting help. "I'll go with you," she said. "No." "Yes. 4 hands can carry more wood than 2, and if you collapse out there, someone needs to drag you back inside." Eleanor was already pulling on her coat. "The children will be fine for 10 minutes. Emma stood up. "I'll watch the Fletcher children, Miss Whitmore. We'll stay right by the stove." Eleanor looked at the 8-year-old trying so hard to be brave and felt her heart break a little. "Good girl. We'll be right back." Outside, the storm was worse than Eleanor had imagined. The wind hit like a physical force, driving snow into her face hard enough to sting. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the wind, could barely breathe. Riker grabbed her hand, his grip crushing. "Stay close. Don't let go." They pushed forward into the whiteout. Eleanor had walked this route hundreds of times, but now she was completely disoriented. Everything looked the same, white and dark, and impossible to navigate. If Riker hadn't been leading her, she would have been lost in seconds. The walk to the church should have taken 2 minutes. It felt like an hour. Eleanor's lungs burned from the cold. Her face went numb. Her hands, even in gloves, lost all feeling. She stumbled repeatedly. Only Riker's iron grip kept her upright. Finally, they reached the church. Riker led her around back to the storage shed, where he kicked the door open and pulled her inside. Eleanor collapsed against the wall, gasping. Her entire body was shaking. She'd been out in the storm less than 5 minutes and already felt like she was dying.
Riker was loading his arms with firewood, moving mechanically despite his own frozen state. Eleanor forced herself upright and did the same. The wood was heavy and awkward, but she loaded herself up until she could barely carry it. "Ready?" Riker asked. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. They went back out into the storm. This time Eleanor knew what to expect, but that didn't make it easier. The wind kept trying to tear her off her feet. The wood in her arms grew heavier with every step. She lost sense of direction completely, trusting only in Riker's hand still locked around her wrist. When they finally stumbled back into the schoolhouse, Eleanor dropped the wood and fell to her knees beside it. She was beyond cold, beyond tired. Her body was shutting down. Riker unloaded his own armful, then immediately started building up the fire. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the kindling, but he got it lit. Flames caught and spread. Heat began to fill the small space. Emma and the Fletcher children helped Eleanor out of her coat. Someone pressed a cup of water into her hands. She drank without tasting it, focused only on getting warm, on breathing, on surviving the next few minutes. Riker fed the fire until it was roaring again, then sank down against the wall. He looked terrible, face gray, lips blue, shaking uncontrollably. "You need to warm up," Eleanor managed through chattering teeth. "So do you." "I wasn't out there as long as you were." "I'm fine." He wasn't fine. Nobody could ride through a killing blizzard and then walk back and forth in a whiteout and be fine. But Eleanor was too cold and too exhausted to argue. She pulled the children close to the fire, wrapped them in every blanket she could find, and tried to keep them calm while the storm raged outside. Hours passed. Eleanor lost track of time. The children eventually fell asleep, huddled together for warmth. Riker fed the fire regularly, moving like a machine, never quite warming up despite the heat. Eleanor watched him when the children weren't demanding her attention, worried by the gray cast to his skin, the way his hands still shook, the careful way he moved like everything hurt. Around midnight, she thought it was midnight. There was no way to know for sure. The wind finally began to die down. By 2 a.m, the storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor stood on stiff legs and looked out the window. The sky was clear, stars brilliant overhead. Snow was piled in massive drifts, but the worst was over. "They'll come for us in the morning," Riker said, his voice rough. "The families, as soon as it's light enough to travel." "We made it." "Yeah, we did." Eleanor turned to look at him. He was still slumped against the wall, exhausted beyond measure, having risked everything to save 3 children and a teacher he barely knew. "Why did you do this? Why risk your life?" "Because I couldn't leave you out here alone." "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is." His eyes met hers. "I couldn't leave you alone, Eleanor. I tried to convince myself Ben Hartley was wrong, that you'd gotten the children home safely before the storm hit. But I couldn't be sure. And the thought of you trapped here, cold and scared with no help coming—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I've lost too many people because I wasn't there when they needed me. I wasn't going to lose you too." The admission hung between them, raw and painful. Eleanor crossed the small space and sank down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You almost died tonight." "But I didn't, and neither did you. This time. This time counts." Riker turned his head to look at her. In the firelight, his eyes were dark and serious. "For what it's worth, I'm glad I came. Even if it was stupid and reckless. I'd rather be stupid and reckless than safe and wondering if you were all right." Eleanor's throat tightened. In Philadelphia, men had said pretty words to her, flowery declarations of devotion that meant nothing. Riker's blunt honestly felt more real than any poetry she'd ever heard. "I'm glad you came too," she said quietly, "and I'm glad you're not dead." High praise. Despite everything, the cold, the fear, the exhaustion, Eleanor smiled. "Don't let it go to your head." They sat together in silence, shoulders pressed together, watching the fire burn while the children slept and the frozen world outside slowly came back to life. Something fundamental had shifted between them tonight. Some barrier had been crossed that Eleanor wasn't sure they could uncross even if they wanted to. And she wasn't sure she wanted to. Dawn came pale and cold through the schoolhouse windows. Eleanor woke, slumped against Riker's shoulder, his coat draped over both of them. The fire burned down to embers.
For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why every muscle in her body ached. Then memory flooded back, the storm, the freezing walk to the church, the endless night keeping watch while 3 children slept. She sat up carefully, trying not to wake Riker. He stirred anyway, his eyes opening slowly. He looked terrible, exhausted, his face still bearing red marks where the wind had flayed him, but alive. "Morning," he said, his voice rough. "Morning." Eleanor stood stiffly and went to the window. Outside, Red Hollow was buried under snow that gleamed white in the early light. Drifts had reshaped the entire landscape. "They'll have to dig out before anyone can reach us."
Give them a few hours. Martin Dietrich will organize it. He's good at that sort of thing. Eleanor rebuilt the fire while Riker checked on the children. They were still sleeping, huddled together for warmth. In sleep, Emma's face had lost its usual worry. She looked like the child she was supposed to be, not the one who'd had to be brave through a terrifying night. "How long have you known the Hartleys?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice low. 10 years, give or take. Ben was one of the first people I met when I came here. He helped me locate my land, taught me about raising cattle in this climate, never asked questions about where I came from or why. Riker fed another log to the fire. "He's a good man. That's why I couldn't leave Emma stranded. You keep doing that, risking yourself for other people." "So do you." Eleanor shook her head. "Last night was different. You rode through a blizzard that could have killed you. You nearly froze to death getting firewood. That's not the same as teaching school, isn't it? You could have gone back east when winter got hard. Could have quit when the Brennan boys made your life miserable. Could have stayed in Philadelphia and married that man you didn't want and lived a comfortable life you'd have hated." Riker looked at her directly. "You chose the hard thing every time because you thought it mattered. That's the same as what I did last night, just over a longer stretch of time." Before Eleanor could respond, voices sounded outside. She rushed to the door and found Martin Dietrich leading a group of men with shovels, carving a path through the snow. Behind them came Ben Hartley on a borrowed horse, his face tight with worry. "Emma!" he called out. The little girl woke and ran to the door. "Grandpa!" Ben practically fell off the horse in his haste to reach her, pulling her into a crushing hug. "Thank all that's holy," I thought. "When the storm hit so fast—" "Miss Whitmore kept us safe," Emma said, her voice muffled against his coat. "And Mr. Boone brought firewood." Ben looked up at Riker with eyes that were suspiciously wet. "You rode out in that storm. Someone had to. You damn fool, you could have died." Ben's voice broke slightly. "Thank you for bringing her back to me." The Fletcher parents arrived moments later, nearly hysterical with relief. They collected their children with shaking hands and tears streaming down their faces, promising Eleanor they'd never forget what she'd done. She tried to tell them she'd only done what anyone would have done, but the words felt hollow. They both knew that wasn't true. Within an hour, the schoolhouse was empty except for Eleanor and Riker. He was preparing to ride back to his ranch. He'd left his cattle unattended for nearly 24 hours now, which meant animals could be dead or dying while he was here. "Let me see your hands first," Eleanor said. "They're fine." "They're not fine. You have frostbite. Let me see." Reluctantly, Riker held out his hands. Eleanor unwrapped the makeshift bandages he'd fashioned from torn cloth. His fingers were red and swollen, several fingertips white with dead tissue. It looked painful and dangerous and could easily get worse without proper treatment. "You need to see Doc Morrison," Eleanor said. "Doc Morrison's drunk by noon most days." "Then you need to see him before noon. Riker, this is serious. You could lose fingers if it gets infected." He pulled his hands back. "I'll manage." "Why are you so stubborn about accepting help?" "Because accepting help means admitting you need it, and needing things from people makes you vulnerable." He said it flatly, like it was an obvious truth. "I learned a long time ago that depending on others means getting hurt when they're not there." Eleanor understood that feeling better than she wanted to admit. She'd spent her whole life in Philadelphia depending on her father, trusting him to protect the family, only to watch him gamble everything away and then try to sell her to cover his debts. Trust was dangerous. Self-reliance was safer. But she was tired of safe, tired of always protecting herself. Tired of being alone even when surrounded by people. "I need help all the time," Eleanor said. "I needed you to fix my stove, to bring me books, to rescue me from freezing to death twice now. Does that make me weak?" "Of course not." "Then why does it make you weak?" Riker stared at her, jaw working. He didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he had an answer but didn't want to say it. Just promise me you'll at least clean the wounds properly, Eleanor said. And if they get worse, you'll see someone. Please. I promise. He picked up his hat. I should go. The cattle? I know. Eleanor walked him to the door. Outside, the morning sun was turning the snow blindingly bright. Thank you for last night, for everything. Stop thanking me. I will when you stop doing things worth thanking you for. The corner of his mouth twitched. Might have been a smile. Then he was gone, riding north through snow that came up to his horse's chest, heading back to his isolated ranch and his self-imposed solitude. Eleanor stood in the doorway long after he disappeared, wondering how someone could be so brave and so afraid at the same time. The next 2 weeks were consumed by recovery and cleanup. School resumed, but with shortened days to accommodate families still digging out from the storm. Eleanor checked obsessively on Emma, the Fletcher children, anyone who'd been caught in the cold. They were all fine, shaken, but fine. The town treated Eleanor differently after the blizzard. Before, she'd been the new schoolteacher, an outsider still proving herself. Now people nodded at her on the street with respect. Women invited her to their homes for tea. Men tipped their hats. Margaret Dietrich showed up at the boarding house with an entire smoked ham and announced Eleanor was too thin and needed proper feeding. You've become one of us, Margaret said simply. You stayed when it got hard. You protected our children. That matters. It did matter. Eleanor felt it in the way students hugged her when they arrived at school, in the way parents sought her advice about their children's education, in the way Mrs. Foster slipped extra food onto her plate at dinner. She'd come to Red Hollow running from one life and somehow built another, a real one, a life that was hers. But Riker stayed away. 10 days passed with no sign of him. Eleanor told herself he was busy with his ranch, with repairing storm damage, with 1,000 things that had nothing to do with avoiding her. She almost believed it. On the 11th day, Tom Brennan arrived at school with a message. Mr. Boone's sick. Pa thought you should know. Eleanor's blood went cold. Sick how? Fever. His hands are infected. He won't leave the ranch to see Doc Morrison. Pa stopped by yesterday to check on him and said he looked half dead. Eleanor dismissed school early and headed straight for the livery stable. She rented a horse. She'd learned to ride tolerably well over the past months, though she'd never be as natural as someone who'd grown up in the saddle, and got directions to Riker's ranch. The ride took over an hour. The ranch sat in a valley north of town, sheltered by low hills and bordered by a creek that was currently frozen solid. It was bigger than Eleanor had imagined. A sturdy house built from logs, a large barn, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures where cattle huddled against the cold. Eleanor tied her horse outside and knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again, harder. Still nothing. She tried the door. It opened. Inside, the house was dark and cold, the fire nearly dead. Riker lay on a bed in the corner, covered in blankets, shaking with fever. Eleanor crossed the room quickly and put her hand on his forehead. He was burning up. His hands, when she unwrapped them, were worse than she'd feared. Swollen, angry red, streaked with lines of infection spreading up his wrists. You absolute fool, she said, though he probably couldn't hear her. Why didn't you get help? She spent the next hour rebuilding the fire, heating water, and cleaning his wounds with the limited supplies she could find in his kitchen. He stirred occasionally, mumbling words she couldn't make out. Once he called out a name, Daniel, in a voice full of pain. His brother, Eleanor guessed. The one who'd died married to a woman he didn't love. When she'd done everything she could with what was available, Eleanor rode back to town and found Doc Morrison. For once, the doctor was sober. She explained the situation, and he grabbed his medical bag without argument. They rode back together in the fading afternoon light. Doc Morrison examined Riker with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wounds more thoroughly than Eleanor had managed, applying salve, rewrapping them with proper bandages. He'll likely lose the tips of 2 fingers, Doc Morrison said. Could be worse. Should have come to me a week ago, but stubborn fools never do. He mixed something in a cup. This is willow bark tea. Get him to drink it when he wakes. Should help with the fever, and make sure he keeps those hands clean and dry. If the red line spread past his elbows, come get me immediately. That means blood poisoning, and he'll die without treatment. Eleanor nodded, trying not to show how terrified she was. How long before we know if he'll be all right? 2 or 3 days. Fever should break by then if it's going to. If it doesn't, Doc Morrison shrugged. Well, then you should probably find a preacher. After the doctor left, Eleanor settled in to wait. She kept the fire going, changed Riker's bandages when needed, and tried periodically to get him to drink water or tea. Mostly he was delirious, lost in fever dreams that made him thrash and cry out. She caught fragments, mentions of Missouri, of fire, of someone screaming. She didn't understand the context, but the pain in his voice was unmistakable. Night fell. Eleanor dozed in the chair beside his bed, waking periodically to check on him. Around midnight, his fever spiked. He was burning up, shaking uncontrollably, his breathing rapid and shallow. Eleanor stripped off the extra blankets, sponged his face and neck with cool water, and prayed, even though she'd tried to stop praying after her mother died and got no answers, that he'd survive until morning. "Don't you dare die," she told him, knowing he couldn't hear her but needing to say it anyway. "Don't you dare. Not after you saved us. Not after you risked everything. You don't get to die now." His eyes opened briefly, unfocused. "Eleanor? I'm here." "Cold. I know. The fever's making you cold. You're going to be all right." "Daniel," his voice broke. "I'm sorry. Should have been there." "Shh. It's all right." "It's not. It's never." He shuddered. "I failed him." Eleanor took his uninjured hand and held it tightly. "You didn't fail anyone. You're a good man, Riker Boone, even if you don't believe it." He didn't respond. The fever pulled him back under. Eleanor sat beside him through the rest of the night, holding his hand, keeping watch the way he'd kept watch over her and the children during the blizzard. It was the least she could do, the very least. Dawn came gray and cold. Riker's fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't gotten worse either. Eleanor made herself eat some of the bread she'd brought from town, checked his bandages again, and tried to figure out how to manage the ranch work. The cattle needed feeding. Water needed to be checked. A dozen things needed doing, and she had no idea how to do any of them. She was trying to figure out how to hay the cattle without getting trampled when she heard horses approaching. Tom and Jake Brennan rode up with their father, all three carrying tools and supplies. "Heard Boone's sick," John Brennan said. "Figured the ranch needs tending. We'll handle it." Eleanor could have cried with relief. "Thank you. I don't know what—" "You stayed with our boys when they needed teaching. You kept Emma Hartley safe during the storm. This is how we say thank you." John dismounted. "Now go take care of Riker. We'll manage out here." They were as good as their word. Over the next 2 days, the Brennan men kept Riker's ranch running while Eleanor stayed inside nursing him through the fever. Other people showed up too. Ben Hartley brought food. Margaret Dietrich brought clean bandages. Even Mrs. Foster made the ride out with a basket of supplies and stern instructions about keeping Riker warm and hydrated. "That man risked his life for Emma," Mrs. Foster said. "For all of us, really. All the times he's helped when he didn't have to. Now it's our turn to help him." On the 3rd day, just after dawn, Riker's fever broke. Eleanor had dozed off in the chair again, and she woke to find him watching her with clear eyes. "You're in my house," he said, his voice rough but lucid. "Yes. You've been sick, do you remember?" He looked at his bandaged hands. "Some of it? The fever got bad. Very bad. Doc Morrison said you'll probably lose 2 fingertips. Eleanor stood and poured water from the pitcher. "Here, drink." He drank slowly, then lay back against the pillows. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by the fever, but alive. Definitely alive. "How long have I been sick?" 3 days? You've been delirious most of that time." "And you stayed?" "Someone had to. You wouldn't come to town for help, so town came to you." Eleanor sat back down. "The Brennan men have been running your ranch. Half of Red Hollow has stopped by with food and supplies. You have a lot of people who care about you, Riker, even if you don't want to admit it." He closed his eyes. "I didn't want anyone here, didn't want people seeing—" He stopped. "Seeing what? That you're human? That you need help sometimes? That you're not invincible?" "Yes, all of that." His jaw tightened. "I built this place to be self-sufficient,
to not need anyone. And then you show up and suddenly He shook his head. Never mind. Suddenly you're what? Nothing. I'm still fevered, not making sense. Eleanor leaned forward. You said a name while you were delirious. Daniel, your brother? Riker's entire body went rigid. I don't talk about Daniel. Maybe you should. Maybe that's part of the problem. There's no problem, and it's none of your concern. His voice had gone flat and cold, pushing her away. Eleanor stood. Fine, keep your secrets. But you should know that everyone in Red Hollow has been worried about you. They came together to help you because they care. And caring isn't weakness. It's what makes us human. She left him there and went outside to help Tom muck out the barn. She was furious and hurt and confused by Riker's determination to stay isolated even when people were trying to help him. After everything they'd been through together, after the conversations and the almost confessions and the night they'd survived the blizzard together, he was still holding her at arm's length. Maybe Sarah had been right. Maybe Riker Boone was too scarred, too isolated, too afraid of connection to let anyone in. Maybe Eleanor was a fool for thinking she could be the exception. She worked until her arms ached, throwing herself into physical labor to avoid thinking. Tom and Jake worked alongside her without comment. They'd grown up a lot over the past months. The surly boys who'd tried to run her out of the classroom had become young men who understood responsibility and showed up when people needed help. When the immediate work was done, Eleanor washed up at the pump and went back inside. Riker was sitting up now, trying to eat the soup Mrs. Foster had left. He looked up when Eleanor entered. I'm sorry, he said. Eleanor stopped. For what? For being a bastard. You stayed here for 3 days taking care of me, and I thanked you by shutting you out. He set down the soup. My brother Daniel, he died in the war. We served together in the same unit. I was supposed to watch his back. His voice went rough. I didn't. He got shot by a Confederate sniper while I was somewhere else, doing something I don't even remember now. By the time I got to him, he was already gone. Eleanor sank into the chair. That wasn't your fault, wasn't it? I was his older brother. I was supposed to protect him. That's what I promised our mother before we enlisted. You were in a war. People die in wars. That doesn't make it your fault. Tell that to my mother. She never forgave me. Said I came home when Daniel should have. Said she wished it had been me instead. Riker stared at his bandaged hands. She died a year later. Heart gave out, but I think she died of grief. Grief I caused by not saving Daniel. Eleanor's throat tightened. No wonder Riker carried such weight, such determination never to fail anyone again. He'd been carrying his brother's death and his mother's blame for over a decade. Your mother was wrong, Eleanor said quietly. She was grieving and angry, and she took it out on you because you were there. But that doesn't make it true. You didn't kill your brother. War killed your brother. Maybe, but I still failed him. So you decided to never fail anyone again, to risk your life helping others so you'd never have to feel that guilt again. Eleanor leaned forward. Riker, you can't save everyone. You can't live your whole life trying to make up for one moment during a war when you weren't in the exact right place at the exact right time. That's not living. That's just slowly destroying yourself. He looked at her finally, his eyes dark and full of pain. What else am I supposed to do? Let people care about you. Accept help when you need it. Stop trying to do everything alone. Eleanor reached for his uninjured hand. Let me care about you. Riker went very still. Eleanor, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I'm just asking you to stop pushing me away. For a long moment he didn't respond. Then slowly, carefully, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His grip was warm and solid and real. I don't know how to do this, he said. Care about someone. Let them care back. I've been alone so long I'm not sure I remember how. Then we'll figure it out together. They sat like that, hands joined, while afternoon light filtered through the windows. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of forever. It was just two damaged people agreeing to try. To stop running long enough to see what might grow between them. It was enough. Over the next week, Riker recovered slowly. Eleanor returned to town to resume teaching, but she rode out to the ranch most evenings to check on him. The rides became something she looked forward to, the quiet of the landscape, the satisfaction of seeing Riker getting stronger each day, the conversations that grew easier as he let his guard down inch by inch. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father, who'd been a stern but fair man, about the farm they'd lost to debt after the war, about drifting west with no destination, just running from memories until he'd found this land and decided to stop. Eleanor told him about her mother, about the charity school, and the way her mother had believed everyone deserved dignity and education regardless of their station, about the crushing loneliness after her mother died and her father became a stranger consumed by gambling and debt, about the moment she'd seen the teaching advertisement and known with absolute certainty that she had to leave. "Do you regret it?" Riker asked one evening as they sat on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "Leaving Philadelphia?" "Sometimes I regret the pain it caused. My father wrote me one letter after I left. It was full of rage and blame. He said I'd destroyed the family, that he'd never forgive me." Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. "I haven't heard from him since. I don't think I ever will." "That's on him, not you." "I know, but it still hurts." "Of course it does. He's your father, but he's also wrong. You didn't destroy anything. You saved yourself." Eleanor looked at Riker, at his weathered face and steady eyes, and felt something settle in her chest. "How do you always know what to say?" "I don't. Half the time I'm guessing." He smiled slightly. "But I've been where you are, carrying blame that isn't yours. Eventually you realize that you can't live your life trying to fix other people's broken expectations. You can only live your own life and hope it's good enough." "Is yours good enough?" Riker was quiet for a moment. "It's getting there. Better than it was 6 months ago." "What changed 6 months ago?"
A stubborn woman from Philadelphia showed up and refused to quit when things got hard. Made me remember that maybe trying is worth something, even when it's difficult. Eleanor felt her cheeks heat. "I didn't do anything special." "You did. You just don't see it." He stood, offering his hand. "Come on, I'll ride back with you before it gets too dark." They rode together through the twilight, talking about everything and nothing, and Eleanor realized with a start that she was happy. Actually, genuinely happy, in a way she hadn't been since before her mother died. The realization was both wonderful and terrifying, because happiness, in her experience, never lasted. March arrived with the first hints of spring. The snow began melting, creating rivers of mud that made every road impassable. School became intermittent as families struggled with spring thaw flooding and early calving season. Eleanor used the irregular schedule to reorganize her curriculum, plan for the spring examination the school committee wanted, and prepare for the end of her first year teaching. She'd survived. Against all odds, despite the brutal winter and the challenging students and her own doubts, she'd survived. More than that, she'd succeeded. Her students were learning, the community respected her, and she'd built something here that felt real and lasting. The only shadow on her growing contentment was Riker's hands. Doc Morrison had been right. He'd lost the tips of 2 fingers on his right hand. They'd healed cleanly, but the loss bothered Riker more than he wanted to admit. His grip was weaker now. Some kinds of ranch work were harder. He never complained, but Eleanor saw the frustration in his face when he struggled with tasks that had been easy before. One afternoon in late March, Eleanor arrived at the ranch to find Riker attempting to repair a section of fence. He was working slowly, awkwardly, clearly in pain, though he'd never admit it. "Let me help," Eleanor said, dismounting. "I can manage." "I know you can, but it'll go faster with 2 people." She picked up the spare hammer before he could argue and began working on the opposite end of the fence. They worked in silence for a while, falling into an easy rhythm. The afternoon was warm, the sun bright, the first wildflowers beginning to bloom on the hillsides. "I've been thinking," Riker said suddenly. "About? About what comes next. For you. The school year ends in 2 months. The committee will want to renew your contract for next year. I'm planning to accept." Eleanor hammered in a nail. "Unless they've decided I'm not suitable. They think you're perfect. Margaret Dietrich told me last week that you're the best teacher Red Hollow's ever had." He paused. "Is teaching here enough for you, or do you want more?" Eleanor stopped working and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you gave up a lot to come here. Comfortable life, social position, a world that made sense to you. I know teaching was better than an unwanted marriage, but is it enough long term? Are you asking if I plan to leave?" "I'm asking if you're happy." Eleanor set down her hammer.
I'm happier here than I ever was in Philadelphia. Yes, I gave up comfort, but I gained freedom. I gained work that matters and friends who care about me, and she stopped, not quite brave enough to finish the sentence. And? Riker prompted. And you. I gained you. Riker went very still. Eleanor, I'm not asking you for anything, she said quickly. I know you're not ready for... I'm not even sure what I'm ready for. I'm just saying that this life, here in Red Hollow, teaching and being part of this community and spending time with you, it's enough, more than enough. Riker crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. He cupped her face in his rough hands, careful with the damaged one, and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. What if I want to offer you more than enough, he said. What if I want to offer you everything? Eleanor's heart stuttered. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm tired of being careful, tired of holding back because I'm afraid, tired of pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than... He stopped, jaw working. I love you, Eleanor Whitmore. I think I have since you refused to quit teaching even when those boys made your life hell, since you rode out in a snowstorm to help dig out the town. Since you stayed here for 3 days nursing me through a fever, I was too stubborn to get treated. His thumb brushed her cheek. You're brave and stubborn and so damn determined to do right by people that it scares me sometimes. And I love you for it. His voice. Eleanor couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at this man who'd saved her life, who'd helped her build a new life, who was looking at her like she was something precious and rare. I love you too, she whispered. I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself, but I can't help it. Riker smiled, a real smile, open and happy in a way she'd never seen from him. Then stop trying, stop protecting yourself. Be with me, not because it's safe or sensible, but because you want to. I do want to. But Riker, I don't know how this works. I've never... With Richard, it was all arrangement and duty. I don't know how to be with someone I actually care about. We'll figure it out, same as we've figured out everything else. He leaned his forehead against hers. I'm not good at this either, but I want to try. With you. Eleanor kissed him. It was impulsive and forward and completely improper, but she didn't care. She'd spent 20 years being proper and dutiful and doing what others expected. This was for her. This moment, this man, this choice. Riker kissed her back with a gentleness that made her want to cry. His damaged hand came up to cup the back of her head, and Eleanor realized he was shaking slightly. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Riker said, "Marry me." Eleanor blinked. What? Marry me. I know it's fast. I know we should probably wait. But I'm 32 years old and I've wasted enough time being careful. I want you in my life, permanently, as my partner, not just someone I'm courting. He took her hands. Marry me, Eleanor. Eleanor's mind was spinning. This was insane. They'd known each other barely 6 months. She'd fled one arranged marriage, running straight into another seemed like madness. Except this wasn't arranged. Nobody was forcing her. Nobody was using her to settle debts or gain position. Riker was offering partnership, equality, a life built together. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I'll marry you. Riker pulled her close, holding her tightly enough that she could feel his heart pounding. Thank you, he said against her hair, for taking a chance on a broken-down rancher who doesn't deserve you. You deserve everything. Eleanor pulled back to look at him. And I'm not taking a chance. I'm making a choice, the best one I've ever made. They stood together in the Montana sunshine. She always thought of it as Montana, even though technically they were in Wyoming territory, surrounded by half-finished fence and wildflowers and endless sky. And Eleanor felt something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Hope. Real, solid, unshakable hope for the future. The news of their engagement spread through Red Hollow faster than wildfire in dry grass. By the time Eleanor returned to the boarding house that evening, Mrs. Foster was already waiting on the porch with her arms crossed and an expression that fell somewhere between delighted and exasperated. Riker Boone proposed, Mrs. Foster said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor dismounted, trying not to smile too broadly. How did you possibly know that already? Tom Brennan was riding past the Boone Ranch when he saw you two kissing by the fence line. He told his mother. She told Margaret Dietrich. Margaret told me.
Mrs. Foster's expression softened.
Well, did you say yes? I did.
Mrs. Foster pulled Eleanor into a hug so tight it knocked the air from her lungs.
About time. That man's been half in love with you since the night he found you freezing on the road. Now come inside, we need to plan.
The next few days were a whirlwind. Margaret Dietrich appeared at the schoolhouse during lunch to discuss wedding arrangements. Sarah Brennan squealed so loudly when Eleanor confirmed the news that half the general store heard her. Ben Hartley shook Eleanor's hand with tears in his eyes and said Emma couldn't have asked for a better example of what it meant to be brave and choose your own path. The school committee met to discuss Eleanor's contract. There was some debate about whether a married woman should continue teaching. Patricia Wells argued it was improper, that Eleanor's place would be at the ranch supporting her husband. But Martin Dietrich shut that down quickly. Miss Whitmore has proven herself the finest teacher this town has seen. Her marital status doesn't change that. If she wants to continue teaching, and if Riker supports it, then the position is hers as long as she wants it. Eleanor signed a new contract on the spot. 1 year, with option to renew. $45 per month. The committee had voted to increase her salary without her asking. She walked out of that meeting feeling like she'd won something important, something that mattered beyond just money or position. But not everything was celebration and planning. 3 days after the engagement, a letter arrived at the boarding house. Eleanor recognized her father's handwriting on the envelope and felt her stomach drop. She took it to her room before opening it, needing privacy for whatever poison it contained. The letter was short and brutal. Her father had heard through mutual acquaintances that she was teaching in some godforsaken frontier town. He'd heard rumors she was engaged to a rancher. He wrote that she'd made her choice when she abandoned her family and her duty, that she was dead to him, that she should never contact him again or expect any inheritance or family connection. He signed it with his full name, not father or even your father, just Harrison Whitmore, like she was a stranger. Eleanor read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in her trunk. She didn't cry. She'd cried for her father months ago, when she'd realized the man who'd raised her had been replaced by someone she didn't recognize. This letter just made it official. That evening, she rode out to Riker's ranch. He was working in the barn, mucking stalls, and looked surprised when she appeared. "Didn't expect you tonight," he said, setting down his pitchfork. "Everything all right?" "My father wrote." Eleanor handed him the letter. "I thought you should see it." Riker read it slowly, his expression darkening. When he finished, he folded it and handed it back. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He made his choice. I made mine." Eleanor tucked the letter in her pocket. "I just wanted you to know that there won't be family from my side at the wedding. No father to give me away. No relatives sending gifts or congratulations. It'll just be me."
"That's not true. You've got Mrs. Foster and Sarah and Margaret and half of Red Hollow." Riker pulled her close. "And you've got me. That's family too. Maybe not the one you were born into, but the one you chose. That counts for something." Eleanor leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and leather and honest work. "He called this place God-forsaken. It probably is, but it's ours, and that makes it worth something." They stood together in the barn while evening light slanted through the gaps in the walls, and Eleanor realized Riker was right. Family wasn't just blood. It was the people who showed up when things got hard, who helped you survive winters and believed you were worth saving. By that measure, she had more family in Red Hollow than she'd ever had in Philadelphia. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in May, after the spring examination, but before the weather turned too hot. Eleanor wanted something simple. She'd already escaped one elaborate wedding, and the thought of another made her anxious. Riker wanted whatever made her happy. They compromised on a ceremony in the small church, followed by a gathering at the community hall, with food and dancing. Sarah insisted on helping Eleanor make a wedding dress. Neither of them were expert seamstresses, but they did their best with cream-colored fabric from the general store and a pattern borrowed from Margaret Dietrich. The dress was simple, practical, with long sleeves and a high collar that would have been considered dowdy in Philadelphia, but felt exactly right for Red Hollow. "You'll be beautiful," Sarah said, pinning the hem. "Riker won't know what hit him. Riker's seen me covered in mud, frozen half to death, and nursing him through fever. I don't think a dress will shock him." "That's different. This is your wedding day. Trust me, he'll notice." Sarah sat back. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you scared? About getting married? Eleanor considered the question. A little, but not about Riker. I'm scared that I won't be good enough at being a rancher's wife, that I'll fail at managing a household or helping with the ranch work or being what he needs. You survived a Wyoming winter teaching school in a building with a broken stove. You kept 3 children alive during a blizzard. You nursed Riker back from near death. Sarah looked at her seriously. If you can do all that, you can figure out how to be a ranch wife. Besides, Riker doesn't need you to be perfect. He just needs you to be you. It was simple advice, but it settled something in Eleanor's chest. She'd spent so much of her life trying to meet other people's expectations, her father's, Philadelphia society's, even her own impossible standards. Maybe it was time to stop trying to be perfect and just try to be honest. The spring examination arrived on a warm afternoon in late April. Parents packed into the schoolhouse to watch their children demonstrate what they'd learned. The younger students read passages from their primers. The middle group solved arithmetic problems on the board. The older students presented short essays on topics ranging from Wyoming Territory history to the principles of animal husbandry. Tom Brennan, who'd started the year barely able to write a coherent sentence, presented an essay on sustainable ranching practices that made his father beam with pride. Emma Hartley read a story she'd written herself about a girl who traveled west to become a teacher. The Dietrich twins demonstrated their mastery of fractions using a pie Margaret had brought for the occasion. When it was over, the parents applauded until Eleanor's face hurt from smiling. Martin Dietrich stood and gave a short speech thanking her for her dedication and announcing that the school committee had voted unanimously to offer her a permanent position. Several parents came forward to shake her hand and promise their children would return next year. Patricia Wells, who'd been Eleanor's harshest critic at the start, approached last. I was wrong about you, she said stiffly. I didn't think a refined Eastern woman could handle frontier teaching. I'm glad you proved me wrong. Coming from Patricia, it was practically a declaration of love. Eleanor accepted it with grace. That night, lying in bed at the boarding house, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed in 8 months. She'd arrived in Red Hollow with nothing but determination and a teaching contract she wasn't sure would be honored. Now she had a career, a community, and a future she'd built with her own hands. The frightened woman who'd fallen asleep beside the road seemed like a stranger, someone from another life entirely. The week before the wedding, Riker took Eleanor out to the ranch to show her the work he'd been doing. He'd repaired the house, patched holes, replaced rotten boards, even built a small addition that would serve as a study where Eleanor could prepare lessons and keep her books. The bedroom had a new bed frame he'd built himself, sturdy and simple. The kitchen had been expanded and outfitted with a proper stove. I know it's not fancy, Riker said, looking nervous. Not what you were used to in Philadelphia. Eleanor turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The house was rough and unfinished in places, but it was solid, built to last. And Riker had clearly put thought into what she'd need: the study, the expanded kitchen, even a bookshelf already waiting for her teaching materials. It's perfect, she said. It's a home, Riker. Our home. Relief washed over his face. I was worried you'd think it was too primitive. I left primitive behind months ago. This is real. That's better than fancy. He showed her the rest of the ranch, the barn with space for her horse, the expanded chicken coop, the garden plot he'd already prepared for planting. He'd been working on all of this while recovering from his injury, while running cattle, while courting her. The amount of work it represented made her throat tight. You did all this for us, she said. For you. I wanted you to feel like this was your place too, not just somewhere you were moving to because you married me. He took her hand. I know you're giving up the boarding house and being close to town. I wanted to make sure you had space here that was yours. Eleanor kissed him, trying to pour into it everything she couldn't quite say, gratitude and love and the bone-deep certainty that she'd made the right choice. When they broke apart, Riker was smiling. So you approve? I more than approve. I love it. I love what you've built, and I love you for building it. The night before the wedding, Mrs. Foster hosted a small gathering for Eleanor at the boarding house. Just women. Margaret Dietrich, Sarah Brennan, Patricia Wells, and a few others. They shared food and stories and advice, some of it useful, much of it mortifying. Eleanor laughed until her sides hurt and felt surrounded by warmth she'd never experienced at the formal ladies' gatherings in Philadelphia. Margaret pulled her aside toward the end of the evening. I know your mother's not here to tell you this, so I will. Marriage is hard work. especially out here where everything is hard work. You'll fight. You'll get frustrated with each other. There will be days you wonder what you've gotten yourself into." Eleanor nodded, bracing for disappointment. "But," Margaret continued, "if you've chosen the right person, and I think you have, it's worth it. Riker's a good man. He'll work himself to death trying to provide for you and never complain about it. Your job is to make sure he knows he doesn't have to be perfect, that you love him anyway." "What if I'm not good enough at being a wife?" "You'll figure it out, same way you figured out teaching in a freezing schoolhouse, with students who didn't want to learn. You're stronger than you think, Eleanor. You've already proven that." The words settled over Eleanor like a blessing. She'd spent so much of her life being told what she should be, who she should become. Margaret was telling her she was already enough, that she just needed to keep being herself. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect May morning that felt like a gift. Eleanor woke early at the boarding house, too nervous to sleep longer. Mrs. Foster brought her breakfast in bed, which Eleanor could barely eat, and helped her dress in the cream-colored gown. Sarah arrived to arrange Eleanor's hair, weaving in wildflowers Margaret had picked that morning. In the mirror, Eleanor barely recognized herself. She looked older than the girl who'd left Philadelphia, harder in some ways, but also more alive. Her hands bore calluses from ranch work. Her face had color from being outdoors. She looked like someone who belonged here. "You ready?" Sarah asked. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Yes, I think I am." The church was packed. It seemed like half of Red Hollow had shown up, along with ranchers and families from miles around. Eleanor walked down the aisle alone. She'd considered asking Martin Dietrich or Ben Hartley to give her away, but ultimately decided she was giving herself away, which felt more honest, and met Riker at the front. He was wearing a new shirt, his hair trimmed, his beard neatly groomed. He looked terrified and happy in equal measure. When Eleanor reached him, he took her hand and squeezed it tightly. "You're beautiful," he whispered. "You're not so bad yourself." The ceremony was simple. The minister spoke about partnership and commitment, about choosing to build a life together even when it was difficult. Riker and Eleanor exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises to support each other, to be honest, to face whatever came together. When the minister declared them married, Riker kissed Eleanor with a gentleness that made several people in the congregation sigh audibly. Walking back down the aisle as husband and wife felt surreal. Eleanor kept expecting someone to object, to say this was wrong or improper, or that she was making a terrible mistake. But all she saw were smiling faces and happy tears and a community celebrating with them. The gathering at the community hall was loud and joyful. There was more food than Eleanor had seen in one place since leaving Philadelphia. Roasted meats, fresh bread, pies and cakes, vegetables from early gardens. Someone had decorated with wildflowers and ribbons. The fiddler played while people danced and children ran wild and laughter filled the space. Eleanor danced with Riker, with Ben Hartley, with Tom Brennan, who was surprisingly graceful, with Martin Dietrich, who stepped on her feet repeatedly but apologized profusely. She ate until she was stuffed. She laughed until her face hurt. And through it all, she kept catching Riker's eye across the room and feeling like maybe, finally, she'd found where she belonged. Late in the evening, as the party was winding down, Eleanor stood outside getting some air. The sun was setting, turning the sky pink and gold. She heard footsteps and turned to find Riker beside her. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Home. The word sent a thrill through her. Not the boarding house, not the schoolhouse. Home with Riker at the ranch they'd built together. "Yes, I'm ready." They said their goodbyes, climbed onto the wagon Riker had decorated with ribbons, and rode north out of town as the last light faded. Stars began appearing overhead, brilliant in the clear sky. The night air was cool and sweet with the scent of new grass. "Happy?" Riker asked. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder. "Terrified and happy. Is that possible?" "That's marriage in a sentence." He wrapped an arm around her. "But we'll figure it out." "We will," Eleanor agreed. And she believed it. Not because it would be easy, but because they'd both already survived so much worse than marriage. Because they'd chosen each other honestly, without illusions or pretense. Because loving someone scared but doing it anyway was the bravest thing either of them had ever done. The ranch house glowed with lamplight as they approached. Riker had lit lamps before they'd left for the ceremony, wanting Eleanor to come home to warmth and welcome. It was a small gesture, but it made her throat tight.
He helped her down from the wagon and carried her over the threshold, which made her laugh. "We're not fancy people, Riker. You don't have to do that." But he insisted. Inside, the house smelled like wood smoke and fresh bread someone had left as a wedding gift. Their home. Their life together, just beginning. That night, wrapped in Riker's arms in their new bed, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. The desperate flight from Philadelphia. The terrifying arrival in Red Hollow. The brutal winter that had tested every bit of her strength and determination. The slow building of trust and love with a man who understood both fear and courage. She thought about her mother, who taught her that everyone deserved dignity and kindness, and hoped she'd be proud of the woman Eleanor had become. She thought about her father, who disowned her for choosing herself, and found she could forgive him even if he'd never forgive her. And she thought about the girl who'd fallen asleep beside a frozen road 8 months ago, exhausted and terrified and certain she'd made a terrible mistake. That girl had been wrong. So wrong. But she'd also been brave enough to keep going despite her fear. That bravery had led here, to this moment, to this life. "What are you thinking?" Riker asked quietly. "That I'm glad I got on that train. Glad I ended up in Red Hollow. Glad you found me that night." Eleanor turned to face him. "My whole life I thought happiness meant safety and comfort and knowing exactly what came next. Turns out it's none of those things." "What is it then?" "This. Choosing something real even when it's hard. Building a life with someone who sees you clearly and loves you anyway. Taking chances that terrify you because the alternative is worse." She paused. "It's not perfect, but it's ours." Riker kissed her forehead. "Good enough for me." They fell asleep like that, tangled together in the darkness. Two people who'd both been lost, finding their way home. Spring turned to summer, and Eleanor settled into her new life with the same determination she'd brought to teaching. She learned to manage a ranch house, to plant and tend a garden, to cook over a temperamental stove, to help with calving and haying and the 1,000 tasks that kept a ranch running. Some days she was good at it. Many days she was terrible at it. But she kept trying, and Riker was patient when she burned dinner or accidentally let the chickens into the garden or nearly got trampled trying to help move cattle. "You're learning," he'd say when she got frustrated. "Nobody's good at this immediately." "You were." "I had 10 years of practice. Give yourself time." Teaching became easier now that she could live at the ranch instead of in town. Riker drove her to the schoolhouse each morning and collected her each afternoon. The routine was comforting. The students returned in September, most of them a little taller and a lot more confident. Tom and Jake Brennan arrived on the first day and immediately volunteered to help with whatever needed doing. Emma Hartley brought Eleanor a bouquet of wildflowers and thanked her for showing that women could be brave and choose their own paths. The school year progressed smoothly, but Eleanor found herself thinking more about what came after teaching. She loved her students, loved the work, but she'd started having other dreams too. Dreams of expanding the ranch, of maybe starting a family, of building something that would last beyond just her lifetime. One evening in October, after dinner, Eleanor brought it up. "How would you feel about expanding the cattle operation? Maybe buying more land to the east where the grass is better?" Riker looked surprised. "That would be expensive and a lot more work." "I know, but I've been saving my teaching salary. We could afford to start small." Eleanor spread out papers she'd been working on, calculations, plans, ideas she'd been developing. "I've been thinking about this for months. We could build something really solid here, something that lasts." Riker studied her plans, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "You're serious about this?" "I am. I love teaching, but I love this ranch too. I want to build it with you. Make it ours, not just yours." He pulled her into his arms. "You've been in my head planning this for how long?" 3 months, give or take. "And you didn't mention it?" "I wanted to make sure it was feasible before I said anything." Eleanor pulled back to look at him. "What do you think?" "I think I married the smartest woman in Wyoming territory." Riker grinned. "Let's do it. Let's build something that lasts." They spent the winter planning and saving. Come spring, they'd purchase additional land and expand the herd. It was ambitious, maybe reckless, but they'd both learned that playing it safe meant never really living. November brought the first snow, and with it a letter that Eleanor had stopped expecting. It arrived on a gray afternoon, addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a short note from a lawyer in Philadelphia informing her that her father had died of a heart attack 3 weeks prior. There was no inheritance. He'd left everything to settle his debts. But the lawyer thought Eleanor should know. She sat in the ranch house kitchen holding the letter, feeling a complicated tangle of grief and relief and regret. She'd lost her father long before he died, but this made it final. There would be no reconciliation, no chance for him to see what she'd built and admit he'd been wrong. Just an ending. Riker found her there when he came in from the barn. He read the letter over her shoulder, then wrapped her in his arms without saying anything. Sometimes silence was better than words. That night, Eleanor wrote a letter to her father that she'd never send. She told him about the school, about the students who'd graduated to the next level, about the ranch and the expansion plans and the life she'd built, about Riker and the marriage she'd chosen, and how it was nothing like the one her father had tried to arrange. She told him she forgave him, even though he'd never asked for forgiveness. And she told him she was happy, which she suspected would have bothered him more than anything else. Then she burned the letter and watched the ashes scatter. Some things needed to be said even if nobody heard them. December arrived with cold that reminded Eleanor of that first terrible winter, but this time she was ready. The ranch was prepared, firewood stacked, supplies laid in, cattle moved to winter pastures. The schoolhouse had a new stove that actually worked, and Eleanor had Riker beside her, steady and solid, facing whatever came. Christmas Day, they hosted dinner at the ranch for anyone who had nowhere else to go. Ben Hartley came, and Doc Morrison, and Sarah Brennan, and a few of the ranch hands who worked for neighboring spreads. It was loud and chaotic, and nothing like the formal Philadelphia Christmases Eleanor remembered. It was better. Late that night, after everyone had left and they were cleaning up, Riker said, "I have something for you." He handed her a small box. Inside was a ring, simple gold, with a small stone that caught the lamplight. Not expensive, but carefully chosen. "Your wedding band doesn't fit right anymore," Riker said. "Your hands have changed from ranch work. Figured you needed one that fit." Eleanor looked at her left hand. He was right. The original ring had gotten too tight from the calluses and muscle she'd developed. This new one slipped on perfectly. "It's beautiful," she said, throat tight. "You're beautiful, even with calloused hands and dirt under your fingernails, and that streak of flour in your hair from making biscuits." He kissed her gently. "Especially like that, actually, because it means you're here, really here, not just visiting my life, but living it with me." Eleanor had cried very little since leaving Philadelphia. She'd trained herself not to, had built walls to protect the vulnerable parts of herself. But standing in their kitchen on Christmas night, looking at the ring that fit her new life, she let the walls crack. She cried for her mother, who would have loved Riker and been proud of the woman Eleanor had become. She cried for her father, who'd died angry and alone because he couldn't forgive her for choosing herself. And she cried from relief and gratitude and the overwhelming knowledge that she'd survived everything meant to break her and come through stronger. Riker held her through it without trying to fix anything or make her stop. He just held her, and that was enough. The new year brought news that the school committee wanted to build a larger schoolhouse. Enrollment was growing as more families settled in the area, and the current building was too small. They asked Eleanor to help design it, to tell them what a proper school needed. She spent weeks creating plans, thinking about everything she'd learned from 8 months teaching in inadequate facilities. The new school would have 2 rooms, proper windows, a functioning stove in each space, and a small library. It would be ready by fall. In March, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The realization came slowly. She'd been tired, vaguely unwell, certain she was just working too hard. When Mrs. Foster gently suggested the real reason during a visit to town, Eleanor was shocked. She hadn't planned this, hadn't thought about children beyond some vague future possibility. She told Riker that evening, uncertain how he'd react. He went very still, then picked her up and spun her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "A baby," he said, his voice wondering. "We're having a baby." "You're happy about this?" "Happy. Eleanor, He set her down carefully, suddenly treating her like she was made of glass. "Are you happy about this?" "I think so. I'm terrified. I don't know anything about babies, but yes, I'm happy." They held each other in the fading light, contemplating the new life they'd created, the future that kept expanding beyond what either had imagined. The pregnancy was difficult. Eleanor had morning sickness that lasted all day. She couldn't ride to the schoolhouse anymore. The jolting wagon made her violently ill. By April, she'd resigned from teaching, turning her position over to a young woman from Denver who'd answered the committee's advertisement. It hurt to give up the work she loved, but Eleanor's body had made the choice for her. She spent the summer preparing for the baby, sewing clothes from fabric Sarah brought, accepting advice from every woman in Red Hollow, trying not to panic about all the ways this could go wrong. Childbirth killed women. She'd lost her mother to fever, but before that she'd lost 2 aunts to childbed complications. The frontier had limited medical care. If something went wrong, there might not be much Doc Morrison could do. Riker seemed to sense her fear without her saying it. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said one night when she couldn't sleep. "You can't promise that." "Then I promise I'll be there. No matter what happens, you won't face it alone." The baby came in late September during an early snowstorm. Labor was long and agonizing and terrifying. Mrs. Foster attended, along with Margaret Dietrich and Doc Morrison, who was sober and competent and kept Eleanor from completely losing herself to panic. Riker stayed close, holding her hand, talking her through the contractions, refusing to leave even when the women suggested he might be more comfortable outside. 20 hours after labor started, Eleanor delivered a healthy baby girl. She was small and red and screaming, and Eleanor loved her instantly with a ferocity that shocked her. "What should we name her?" Riker asked, cradling their daughter with surprising gentleness for a man with such rough hands. Eleanor had thought about this for months. "Grace, after my mother." "Grace Boone," Riker smiled. "I like it. Think she'll be a teacher like her mother? Or a rancher like her father? Or something entirely different that we can't imagine yet? As long as she's brave enough to choose for herself, I'll be happy." They sat together in their bedroom while snow fell outside, and their daughter slept between them, and Eleanor marveled at how completely her life had changed. 2 years ago, she'd been trapped in Philadelphia facing a loveless marriage. Now she was a rancher's wife, a former teacher, a mother. She'd survived a brutal winter, built a career, fallen in love with a scarred man who understood both fear and courage. She'd lost her father but gained a family. She'd run from everything she'd known and found exactly what she'd needed. It hadn't been smooth. Nothing worth having ever was. There'd been moments she'd wanted to quit, wanted to go back to Philadelphia and accept whatever safety she could find there. But she'd kept going, kept choosing the harder path because it was hers. And that choice, repeated over and over, had led here. Grace stirred, making small noises. Eleanor picked her up, marveling at the tiny perfection of her features. This was what courage created, not just survival, but new life, new possibilities, a future that belonged to someone else to shape. "What are you thinking?" Riker asked. "That I'm glad I got on that train. Glad I ended up here. Glad I chose you in this life, even when it was hard." "No regrets?" Eleanor considered. "Plenty of regrets. I regret that my father died angry. I regret not bringing more practical clothes from Philadelphia. I regret 1,000 small decisions that made things harder." She looked at her husband. "But I don't regret the big choice. Coming here. Building this life. That was right. Even though you nearly froze to death your first night, especially because of that, because it taught me that I was tougher than I thought, that I could survive things I didn't think I could survive, that choosing the hard thing was often choosing the right thing." Riker reached over and took her hand. His damaged hand, with the 2 missing fingertips that would always remind them both of the night he'd ridden through a blizzard to save her and 3 children. "You know what I learned from you?" "What?" "That running isn't always cowardice. Sometimes running is the bravest thing you can do. You ran from a life that would have destroyed you. That took more courage than staying and accepting it." He squeezed her hand. "You saved yourself, Eleanor. I just helped a little along the way." It was the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. Eleanor had spent so long feeling guilty for leaving Philadelphia, for abandoning her father, for choosing herself over family duty. But Riker was right. She'd saved herself. And in doing so, she'd built something better than anything that had been planned for her. Grace made a fussy noise. Eleanor nursed her while Riker rebuilt the fire and brought them both water. Outside, the snow continued falling, blanketing the ranch in white. Winter was coming again. But this time, Eleanor wasn't afraid. She knew what to expect now, knew how to survive it. Knew that spring always followed winter, no matter how brutal the cold. The years that followed brought their share of hardship, droughts that threatened the cattle, harsh winters that tested their endurance, times when money was tight and work was endless. Grace grew into a fierce, independent child who loved horses and hated sitting still. Riker's hands never fully recovered from the frostbite, making some work difficult. Eleanor never returned to teaching full-time, though she sometimes tutored students in the summers. But they built something lasting. The ranch expanded until it was one of the most successful operations in the territory. They added 2 more children, a boy named Daniel after Riker's brother, and another girl they called Catherine, who had her mother's stubborn determination and her father's quiet strength. The new schoolhouse opened and flourished. Red Hollow grew from a struggling frontier town into a real community. And Eleanor and Riker built a marriage that wasn't perfect, but was real. They fought sometimes, usually about money or how to handle the children or whether they were working too hard. But they learned to fight fair and apologize when they were wrong and choose each other even when it was difficult. They learned that love wasn't just the easy moments of passion and happiness. It was the choice to keep showing up, keep trying, keep building something together, even when you were exhausted and frustrated and wondering if it was worth it. It was always worth it. 20 years after Eleanor first arrived in Red Hollow, she stood on the porch of the ranch house and watched her children playing in the yard. Grace was 17 now, preparing to attend teaching college in Denver. Daniel was 15 and already taller than his father, working the ranch with the ease of someone born to it. Catherine was 12 and currently trying to convince her parents to let her start breaking horses for neighboring ranches. Riker came up behind Eleanor and wrapped his arms around her waist. He was 52 now, more gray than brown, his face deeply weathered from decades outdoors, but his eyes were still the same steady brown that had looked at her with such certainty the night they survived the blizzard together. "Regretting it yet?" he asked, his familiar question. "Never," Eleanor answered, her familiar response. "Even though it was hard, especially because it was hard. The easy path would have destroyed me. The hard path made me who I am." It was true. The woman standing on this porch bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who'd arrived in Red Hollow 2 decades ago. That girl had been shaped by other people's expectations, bent into a form that didn't fit, taught that her value came from obedience and propriety. This woman was shaped by her own choices, built from survival and determination and the courage to keep going when everything said to quit. She'd learned that home wasn't a place you were born, but a place you built. That family wasn't just blood, but the people who chose to stand beside you. That strength wasn't never being afraid, but doing what mattered despite the fear. That love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but finding someone who saw your imperfections and loved you anyway. She'd learned that sometimes the wilderness wasn't just a physical landscape, but an internal journey. That the hardest thing wasn't surviving the brutal winters or the isolation or the endless work. It was surviving your own doubts, your own fear, your own voice telling you that you weren't enough. And she'd learned that you were always enough, not because you were perfect, not because you never failed, but because you kept trying, kept choosing, kept building something real from the raw materials of courage and stubbornness and desperate hope. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in colors Eleanor had never seen in Philadelphia. Deep gold and burning orange and purple, so rich it looked unreal. Her daughter was arguing with her son about something. Her husband was solid and warm behind her. Her life was imperfect and difficult, and exactly what she'd needed. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "For what?" "For finding me that night. For not leaving me on the road. For showing me that choosing the hard thing could lead somewhere good." Riker kissed the top of her head. "You would have figured it out without me." "Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to." They stood together watching the sunset, 2 people who'd both been lost finding their way home, and Eleanor thought about all the women who might be standing at similar crossroads right now. Women trapped in lives that didn't fit, contemplating whether to run or stay. Women wondering if they had the courage to choose themselves over duty. Women terrified that leaving everything they knew would destroy them. She couldn't tell them what to do. Everyone's path was different, but if she could tell them anything, it would be this: you're stronger than you think. The hard path is terrifying, but it's often the one that leads somewhere real. And sometimes running isn't cowardice. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. Because Eleanor had run. She'd fled Philadelphia with almost nothing, landed in a frozen wilderness, nearly died her first night, and spent years building something from scratch. It had been brutal and difficult and frequently terrifying. It had also been the best decision she ever made. The girl who'd fallen asleep beside a Wyoming road was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd survived winters that should have killed her, who'd built a school and a ranch and a family from nothing, who'd learned that the frontier wasn't just a place, but a way of seeing the world, full of possibility and danger, and the chance to become whoever you were brave enough to be. And that was worth everything. Worth the fear and the cold and the endless struggle. Worth leaving comfort behind. Worth choosing the unknown over the familiar. Worth running towards something, even when you didn't know what that something was yet. The sun slipped behind the mountains. Stars began appearing overhead. Inside the house, Catherine called that dinner was ready. Life continued its endless rhythm of work and rest, struggle and joy, the small moments that added up to something extraordinary when you looked back at them all together. Eleanor took Riker's hand and walked inside, ready for whatever came next. Because that was what she'd learned in 20 years on this harsh, beautiful frontier. You faced what came. You did the work. You chose the people who mattered and built something lasting with them. And you never, ever stopped running toward the life you deserved, no matter how hard the road got. That was the lesson. Not that everything worked out perfectly. Not that choosing yourself guaranteed happiness. But that the choice itself, the brave, terrifying choice to run toward something better, even when you had no guarantee it would work, that choice was what made you whole. Eleanor had made that choice 20 years ago on a Philadelphia street corner when she'd walked away from everything she'd known. She'd make it again every single day if she had to. Because some things were worth running for, and some wildernesses, no matter how harsh, led exactly where you needed to go.